Hello, my friend. Welcome back. Or if this is your first night with me, come in, get comfortable, and let the day go. I'll be honest with you, this little channel only keeps going because of people like you. So before we begin, I want to ask you directly, if these stories help you drift off, if they've become part of your evening, please take a moment to hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. It genuinely makes a difference, and it helps me keep making these for you. It only takes a second and it means the world. Now, tell me, where are you listening from tonight? Maybe you're under a blanket somewhere in England with the rain outside. Maybe you're in your favourite chair in the States, the house finally quiet. I love knowing we're all drifting off together at different hours, listening to the same voice. Drop a comment and let me know. I read everyone. Now, get comfortable. Let's begin. Picture the wealthy Roman woman, the version of her that lives in your head from a film you half remember. She's draped in white linen that somehow never wrinkles, reclining on a couch, a servant fanning her with peacock feathers while grapes are lowered toward her mouth on a silver tray. Forget her. She's a costume department's idea of Rome, not Rome itself. The real wealthy Roman woman is far stranger and far more interesting than that, and she is almost never lying down doing nothing. More often, she's standing in a cramped little office off the atrium of her house, a wax tablet in one hand and a bronze stylus in the other, going over the accounts of a brickyard she owns on the outskirts of the city, arguing quietly with a freedman about the price of a shipment of amphorae that has just come in from the coast. Let me build her for you properly, because I think you will recognise pieces of her even across 2,000 years. Maybe she's a woman somewhere in her 40s, a widow now, who inherited her husband's shipping interests and, rather than handing them to a male relative the way everyone assumed she would, simply kept running them herself. Maybe she is younger than that, newly married under a legal arrangement that, strangely enough, left her financially independent from her own husband, in a way that would not exist again in much of Europe for another 16 or 17 centuries. Maybe she is a freedwoman, a former slave who bought her own liberty with money she saved from selling bread at a stall near the Forum, and who now owns the bakery outright and employs 6 people, 2 of whom used to own her. All 3 of these women existed. Not as fictions, as documented, specific, named human beings, whose brick stamps and funerary inscriptions and legal records survive in museums and archives right now, tonight, while you lie there listening. And here is the detail that I want to leave sitting in the room with you before we go any further, because it is the quiet contradiction underneath everything we're going to talk about tonight. Roman women could not vote. They could not hold public office. They could not technically represent themselves in a court of law. A Roman woman, by the letter of the law, was supposed to spend her entire life under the legal authority of a man, first her father, then her husband, or a guardian appointed to oversee her decisions. And yet, some of the richest, most economically powerful individuals in the entire Roman world, individuals who owned fleets of ships and rows of brick factories and city blocks of rental housing, who funded public buildings with their own money and had their names carved into marble across the empire, were women. The system that was built to keep her small produced almost by accident some of the wealthiest people who ever lived in the ancient world. Sit with that for a moment. We are going to spend the rest of tonight understanding exactly how that happened. One woman, one law, one brick stamp, one perfume jar at a time. It is somewhere near dawn in a coastal Italian town, let us say the late 1st century, and the air already smells of salt and baking bread and the faint sourness of fish sauce being decanted into jars 2 streets over. Somewhere behind a plain, unremarkable door on a street that gives no hint of what is inside, a woman is already awake, already dressed, already reading a wax tablet by lamplight before the household slaves have even finished lighting the kitchen fire. That is where we begin. Her name, for the purposes of tonight, is Aurelia. I want to be honest with you about something right away. She's not one single person pulled whole from the historical record. She's a composite, built from dozens of real women whose lives left traces in stone and wax and clay, women whose names we do know, women like Eumacia and Omidia Quadratilla and Domitia Lucilla, whom we will meet properly before the night is over. Aurelia lets us walk through an ordinary wealthy household without getting lost in footnotes. But everything that happens to her tonight, every legal detail, every business transaction, every ring on her finger, is drawn from something that actually happened to an actual Roman woman, somewhere between the founding of the Republic and the slow grey twilight of the Western Empire. To understand how Aurelia came to own what she owns, we have to go back a little further than her own lifetime, because Roman property law is where this whole strange contradictory system begins, and I promise you, this is not going to feel like a lecture. Think of it more as learning the rules of a game before we watch someone play it exceptionally well. Every Roman citizen, in theory, existed inside the legal shadow of a man called the pater familias, the male head of the household, who held something the Romans called patria potestas, the power of the father. This was not a gentle symbolic authority. In the earliest and harshest interpretations of Roman law, the paterfamilias held the power of life and death over everyone in his household, his children, his slaves, and yes, technically, his wife, depending on the type of marriage she had entered. A daughter did not leave her father's legal authority when she married, not automatically. She simply moved from one man's household to another's, or in a great many cases, and this is the detail that changes everything. She did not move under her husband's authority at all. There were two basic kinds of Roman marriage, and the difference between them is the hinge on which almost everything else tonight swings. The first was called marriage cum manu, literally marriage with the hand, meaning the wife passed entirely out of her father's legal authority and into her husband's. Under this arrangement, everything she owned or would come to own belonged legally to him. This was the older form, the form of early Rome, the Rome of legend and austere farmer senators, and by the time we reached the late Republic, it was already becoming rare among the wealthy classes. The second kind, and this is the one that matters most for our story tonight, was marriage sine manu, marriage without the hand. Under sine manu marriage, a wife remained, legally, under the authority of her own father, or, if her father had died, she became what the Romans called sui juris, a woman of her own legal right, subject only to a guardian, a tutor, whose actual power over her decisions grew steadily weaker as the centuries passed. Here is the almost accidental brilliance of it, or perhaps I should call it the almost accidental crack in the wall. A woman married sine manu did not merge her property with her husband's. Whatever she brought into the marriage, whatever she inherited from her father, whatever she earned, whatever she was given, remained legally hers, entirely separate from her husband's estate. If the marriage ended in divorce, which happened with a casualness that might genuinely surprise you for a supposedly conservative society, she kept it. If her husband died, she kept it. If her husband made terrible business decisions and drowned in debt, her property, in principle, remained untouched, protected behind a wall of law that had nothing to do with protecting women and everything to do with protecting family bloodlines and inheritance chains, but which functioned, in practice, exactly like protection. By the time we reach Aurelia's world, the late 1st century of our era, sine manu marriage had become overwhelmingly the norm among families with anything worth protecting. A bride brought a dowry, called a dose, into the marriage, money or property handed over by her father to help support the new household. But the dowry was not simply a gift lost forever into her husband's coffers. Roman law developed increasingly firm rules around what happened to a dowry if a marriage ended, rules that required a husband, in most circumstances, to return it, sometimes in full, sometimes minus, deductions for misconduct on the wife's part, but returned nonetheless. Fathers, understandably, took a very close interest in seeing that their daughters' dowries were protected, since a daughter's financial security reflected on the whole family's standing. And then there was everything beyond the dowry. Money a woman inherited from her own father or mother, property left to her by a childless uncle, money she earned herself, through trade, through rents, through the labour of slaves she personally owned and directed. All of it belonged to her outright, managed in the earliest periods with the notional oversight of a guardian, but by the height of the imperial era, that guardianship had become, for most practical purposes, a formality so thin it was barely felt. a woman who had produced 3 children under a law passed by the Emperor Augustus called the trium liberorum. The right of 3 children could be released from the requirement of a guardian altogether. Freed women with 4 children received the same privilege. Suddenly you have a legal category of person who owns property outright, answers to no one for how she manages it, and cannot vote, cannot hold office, and cannot in most circumstances represent herself directly in the highest Roman courts. Wealthy, independent, and by the formal architecture of the state, powerless. That contradiction did not resolve itself neatly. It simply sat there, generation after generation, and certain women exactly like our Aurelia, learned to live inside the gap it created and to grow enormously rich within it. Let me show you what that looked like at the very top of Roman society before we come back down to Aurelia's more modest, more ordinary kind of wealth. Because if you want to understand how far a Roman woman's fortune could reach, you have to start with Livia Drusilla, wife of the Emperor Augustus, and one of the shrewdest financial minds of the ancient world, full stop, regardless of gender. Livia was born into an old, well-connected family, married first to a man named Tiberius Claudius Nero, and then, in a divorce and remarriage so scandalously fast that Roman gossip never entirely stopped chewing on it, married to Octavian, the young man who would become the Emperor Augustus, while she was still visibly pregnant with her first husband's second child. That is the kind of detail that tends to overshadow everything else about a woman in the historical record. The scandal, the romance, the palace intrigue. But underneath the gossip, Livia was quietly building one of the largest private fortunes in the history of Rome, and she was doing it the way most serious Roman wealth was built, through land, through property, and through industry that never touched her own soft, well-manicured hands. She owned brickyards, actual, functioning, profitable brick and tile manufacturing operations, the kind of unglamorous industrial infrastructure that built the walls and floors and roofs of half the buildings in Italy. We know this because Roman bricks, extraordinarily, were often stamped before firing with the name of the estate or the owner who produced them, a kind of ancient trademark pressed into wet clay by a slave's thumb or a wooden die. And archaeologists have pulled bricks out of the ground bearing Livia's name, her brand, if you want to think of it that way, on building material used across the Roman world. Think about that for a moment. Somewhere in the foundations of buildings that have long since crumbled, in walls that held up Roman apartment blocks and villas and public baths, there were bricks that a woman's factory had made. Bricks that carried her name into structures she would never personally see completed. She also owned estates that produced fruit, particularly a variety of fig that apparently bore her name, the Liviana fig, prized enough that later Roman writers on agriculture mention it specifically. She held property in Gaul, in Egyptian territory, that supplied grain, copper mines that Augustus himself formally granted to her. An extraordinarily direct gift of productive, revenue-generating land from the most powerful man in the world to his wife, held in her own name under her own control. This was not pin money. This was industrial and agricultural wealth on a scale that rivaled senators, and Livia managed it, or at least directed its management, with the same careful attention she brought to the political maneuvering for which history remembers her more loudly. And here is a detail I find myself genuinely admiring every time I come back to it. After Augustus died, Livia did not fade into a quiet, decorative widowhood. She continued acting as a patron, funding building projects, supporting clients and allies, wielding the kind of soft, financial influence that let her remain one of the most powerful individuals in Rome for another decade and a half under the reign of her son, the Emperor Tiberius, who by most accounts found his mother's continued prominence more than a little exhausting. There is something almost funny in that. An emperor of Rome, ruler of the known world, visibly irritated by how much independent financial and political weight his own mother still carried in the city. She had money he did not fully control. She had relationships with senators and client kings that predated his reign by decades. Power, once a woman like Livia had built it into stone and land and brick, was extraordinarily difficult to simply legislate away. Now, I do not want to leave you with the impression that every wealthy Roman woman operated on Livia's imperial scale, because that would flatten something important. Most of the women whose fortunes we can trace through the historical and archaeological record were not empresses. They were the wives and widows and daughters of the merchant class, the equestrian order, the local elite of provincial towns you have probably never heard of. And it is in that middle layer of Roman society, honestly, that the story becomes most vivid, because these were women managing real hands-dirty businesses, not simply presiding over an emperor's estates from a marble palace. Let me take you to Pompeii for a moment, because Pompeii, frozen the way it was under ash in the year 79, gives us something almost no other Roman site can offer, a snapshot of ordinary commercial life stopped mid-motion, and one of its clearest, sharpest snapshots belongs to a woman named Eumacheia. Eumacheia was the daughter of a brickmaker, which tells you something immediately about where wealth in Roman Italy actually came from, not from idle inheritance alone, but from industry, from clay and fire and labour organised at scale. She married into another prominent local family, and by the time we meet her in the archaeological record, she is one of the wealthiest individuals in the entire city. And what did she do with that wealth? She built a building, not a small one, a large, imposing structure right on the edge of the Forum, the public square at the absolute heart of Pompeian civic life, a building that still stands today, its facade still legible, still bearing an inscription carved directly into the stone that tells you in Latin exactly who paid for it and why. The inscription records that Eumacheia, public priestess, built the building, its covered passage and its portico at her own expense in her own name and that of her son, and dedicated it to Concordia and Augustan piety. She built it for the fullers, the guild of clothworkers and launderers who processed and cleaned Roman wool, a trade her own family fortune had likely touched through the brickmaking and building materials industry that fed into every corner of the local economy. A statue of her, discovered in a niche at the back of the building, shows a woman in formal, heavy draped clothing, dignified, composed, entirely unremarkable to look at, which is in a strange way exactly the point. She did not need to look remarkable, the building spoke for her. I want you to sit with the scale of that for a second, because it is easy to let it slide past as just another archaeological fact. A woman in a Roman provincial town funded and built one of the largest and most architecturally significant structures in the entire public forum, using her own money, and had her name, not her husband's, not her father's, carved permanently into its front wall for every citizen entering the forum to see for the rest of the city's existence. Roman women could not sit on the town council, they could not vote for the magistrates who ran Pompeii's civic affairs, and yet the physical, visible heart of that civic life, the buildings people walked past every single day, carried women's names on them because money, unlike political office, was not formally barred to women, and money in the end buys a very particular, very durable kind of permanence. Eumacheia was not alone in this, not by a long stretch. Eumedia Quadratilla, a wealthy woman who lived a little later in the town of Cassinum, owned something that might surprise you even more than a public building, a troupe of gladiators and pantomime performers, kept as her personal property, hired out for public entertainments, an investment that generated income the way a modern person might own a small entertainment company. We know about her largely through the letters of Pliny the Younger, who attended her funeral and described, with a kind of bemused, slightly scandalized fondness, how she filled her long widowhood watching her own performers rehearse, gambling for modest stakes, and generally living exactly as she pleased, while also, notably, funding the construction of an amphitheatre and a temple in Cassinum, structures that again bore her name. Pliny's letter about her death is worth pausing on, because it captures something the surviving stone inscriptions cannot. He writes about her grandson, a young man named Ummidius Quadratus, whom she had raised carefully, keeping him deliberately away from her more disreputable entertainments, and about how she died at nearly 80 years old, having watched a performance by her own troupe on what turned out to be the last full day of her life. There is something quietly moving in that image, an elderly, formidably wealthy woman, entirely in command of her own household and her own considerable fortune until the very end, still enjoying the spectacle her own money had built, right up until she went to bed and simply did not wake again. Now, I promised you Fulvia, and I do not want to leave her out, because she represents something a little different. Wealth used not just to build and to manage, but to wage actual literal war. Fulvia lived through the last chaotic decades of the Roman Republic, married in succession to three of the most dangerous men in Roman politics: Clodius Pulcher, a violent populist agitator who was eventually murdered in a street brawl; Scribonius Curio; and finally Mark Antony, the general who would go on to lose an empire's worth of power alongside Cleopatra. Through each marriage, Fulvia accumulated not just money but something rarer: direct political and military influence that she wielded with a boldness that scandalized even Rome's fairly generous tolerance for aristocratic women behaving with confidence. When Mark Antony was away from Italy, occupied with his endless political maneuvering against Octavian, Fulvia, by several ancient accounts, effectively ran his political operation in Rome. She is described organizing and supporting armed forces, appearing before soldiers, wearing a sword at her side according to some hostile later sources, though we should treat that particular image with a healthy pinch of skepticism, since almost everything written about Fulvia survives through the pens of men who despised her and wanted her remembered as monstrous and unnatural, a woman who had stepped grotesquely outside her proper sphere. Even accounting for that hostile bias, though, the underlying facts are difficult to erase. She raised troops, she held besieged cities during the conflict later called the Perusine War. Coins were minted, actual circulating currency, bearing what many historians believe is her image, or at least an image closely associated with her, an extraordinary thing for any Roman woman of her era, since coinage was one of the most tightly controlled visual languages of Roman male political power. She died in exile, abandoned somewhat unceremoniously by Mark Antony as he pivoted toward his relationship with Cleopatra, and later Roman writers, particularly those writing under the new regime of Augustus, treated her memory with real venom, using her as a cautionary tale about what happened when a woman's ambition outran what was considered natural. But strip away the moralizing, and what remains is a woman who used inherited and marital wealth to fund armies, hold territory, and shape the outcome of a civil war at a moment when Rome itself was being violently reinvented. That is not a footnote. That is one of the more remarkable exercises of female economic and political power in the ancient world, largely erased from casual popular memory, because the men who wrote the history books that survived found her deeply, personally inconvenient to remember kindly. I mentioned Fulvia partly to widen the frame, because tonight is mostly going to live in the quieter, more domestic register of women like Aurelia and Eumacia, women who built wealth through brickyards and shipping interests and rental property rather than through armies. But it is worth knowing, as we settle back down into that quieter world, that the outer edge of what Roman female wealth could accomplish stretched all the way out to funding civil wars. The gap between Aurelia balancing her accounts by lamplight and Fulvia commanding besieged troops is enormous. But it is the same underlying legal and economic architecture, sine manu marriage, independent property rights, inherited fortune, that made both of them possible. There is one category of Roman woman I have not mentioned yet, and she deserves her own quiet space in this story, because her legal position was so strange, so unlike anything else in Roman society, that it almost feels like a loophole someone forgot to close. I am talking about the Vestal Virgins, the 6 priestesses who tended the sacred fire of the goddess Vesta in a small round temple at the edge of the Roman Forum, and who, uniquely among Roman women, were released entirely from the authority of a father or a guardian the moment they entered service. A Vestal was selected as a young girl, somewhere between the ages of 6 and 10, from a small pool of eligible candidates, and she served for a minimum of 30 years, learning the rites in her first decade, performing them in her second, and teaching newer Vestals in her third, after which she was technically free to leave and even marry, though very few did, since by that point she would be somewhere in her late 30s or early 40s, financially independent, socially revered, and, frankly, under no particular pressure to hand her considerable autonomy over to a husband. The moment a girl became a Vestal, she stepped out from under her father's patria potestas entirely, without the usual mechanism of marriage that would simply transfer her to a husband's authority instead. She became legally her own person, in a way that essentially no other Roman woman, married or unmarried, could claim. This meant a Vestal could own property outright. She could make a will, disposing of her estate exactly as she chose, a right most Roman women could only exercise with a guardian's formal, and usually fairly nominal, approval. She could appear as a witness in legal proceedings, could give evidence, could inherit freely, and received as part of her role a substantial public salary along with gifts and bequests from wealthy Romans eager to curry favour with a priesthood believed to hold the safety of the entire city in its hands, quite literally, since the fire the Vestals tended was thought to protect Rome itself, and its accidental extinguishing was treated as a genuine civic emergency requiring urgent ritual correction. Vestals accumulated real wealth over their long decades of service, and some of them became remarkably prominent public patrons in their own right, funding building projects and public works, their names appearing on inscriptions with an ease and directness that other Roman women, still technically under a guardian's shadow, rarely achieved. There is something almost poignant in the shape of that arrangement when you sit with it for a moment. The one category of Roman woman granted genuinely full legal independence was also the one category of Roman woman required to remain celibate for 30 years under threat of being buried alive if she broke that vow, a punishment reserved specifically, chillingly, for unchastity among the Vestals, since Roman law considered it inappropriate to spill a priestess's blood directly. Freedom, in the Vestal's case, came bundled with one of the most severe and specific forms of bodily control the Roman state ever formally codified. It is a strange trade, and I do not think the Romans themselves fully reconciled it either. They simply built the system and lived inside its contradictions, the same way they built the contradiction that let Aurelia and Livia and Eumachia grow rich while remaining on paper politically voiceless. Before we go back to Aurelia and the more ordinary, everyday texture of a wealthy Roman household, I want to tell you about one more woman, because her story survives in a form unlike almost anything else from the ancient world, carved not by a historian trying to make a political point, but by her own grieving husband on a long funerary inscription that archaeologists now call the Laudeio Turiae, the praise of Turia, even though we are not entirely certain her name was really Turia at all. The stone that survives is broken and incomplete, her name lost in the gaps, but the content is so vivid, so specific, that historians simply gave her the name by convention and moved on, the way you might name a beloved but unidentified photograph. Turia lived through the brutal civil wars and proscriptions of the late Republic, the period when political enemies were formally declared outlaws and could be killed on sight, their property seized by the state, their names posted on public lists in the Forum. Her husband, whoever precisely he was, survives to us only through his own words on this stone, and what he describes is extraordinary. When her parents were murdered, apparently in a moment of chaos connected to that same violent political unrest, Turia, still young, pursued justice for their deaths herself, personally, in a legal system that technically expected women to act through a male representative. She defended the family inheritance against relatives trying to seize it in her absence. She protected her husband when he himself was proscribed, hiding him, according to the inscription, in their own house at enormous personal risk, while she worked behind the scenes to secure his eventual pardon. And here is the detail that I think about most, out of everything on that broken, weathered stone. Turia and her husband apparently could not have children, and rather than divorcing him to seek a more fertile marriage elsewhere, which Roman social convention would have entirely permitted and even expected, Aurelia is recorded as having offered, apparently sincerely, to step aside and allow her husband to have children with another woman while remaining in some capacity part of the household, so that he would not lose the line of descent Roman men were so intensely anxious about. He refused. The inscription records his refusal in language that still, after 2,000 years, carries something close to real tenderness. A husband insisting he would rather remain childless than lose the wife whose courage and financial acumen had quite literally kept them both alive through a civil war. We do not know how wealthy Aurelia's household ultimately was, not with precision, but we know it was substantial enough to be worth seizing, substantial enough to fund a prolonged legal battle, substantial enough that her management of it during her husband's dangerous absence mattered materially to their survival. What her story gives us that the brick stamps and building inscriptions cannot is interiority, the sense of what it might have actually felt like to be a Roman woman managing an estate and a household and a legal defense simultaneously, under conditions of genuine terror, and to be remembered afterward not primarily for the money, but for the courage that money and legal standing had allowed her to exercise. Let us go back to Aurelia now, and let us stay there for a while, because I think the texture of an ordinary wealthy Roman household is where this story actually breathes best. Not in the grand political drama of Fulvia's armies or the imperial scale of Livia's brickyards, but in the quiet, granular reality of a woman running a household and a business at the same time, somewhere in provincial Italy, in a house you could still in your mind walk through room by room. Her house, her domus, does not look like much from the street. This is one of the strange, deliberate features of Roman domestic architecture that surprises people every time I describe it. The street-facing wall of a wealthy Roman house was almost always plain, blank, sometimes broken only by the doorways of shops that the family rented out to tenants, shops that might sell bread or wine or hardware, run by people who had no idea most days that the woman who owned the building above their heads was worth more than most of the local council combined. Wealth in the Roman domestic tradition was not something you displayed to the street. It was something you revealed slowly, deliberately, to people you allowed inside. You step through the narrow entrance corridor, the forces, and the house opens up in front of you the way a held breath finally releases. The atrium spreads out, its ceiling open to the sky in a rectangular gap called the compluvium, rain falling in a controlled sheet directly into a shallow pool below called the impluvium, the sound of it, on a wet morning, a steady, almost musical patter against still water. Light pours down through that opening in a way that no artificial lamp could replicate, catching the bronze and marble around the room, throwing long shadows from the household shrine, the liberorum, where small statues of the family's protective spirits stand in a modest niche, tended daily with offerings of wine and incense, however small. Aurelia is awake before most of her household, which surprises people who assume wealth automatically buys idleness. It does not. Not for a woman actually managing her own affairs. She rises in the dark hours before dawn, and a slave, an ornatrix trained specifically in hairdressing, begins the long, careful work of arranging her hair into the elaborate architecture fashionable Roman women wore in public. A structure of curls and braids built up and pinned in place with bone hairpins, sometimes with the addition of a hairpiece, since fashionable volume was often simply beyond what a woman's natural hair could produce on its own. This takes time. It is not vanity in the way we sometimes flatten that word today. It is a form of visible, legible status. The same instinct that makes a modern executive choose a particular suit, a signal read instantly by everyone she encounters that day. While her hair is being built, Aurelia is already going through wax tablets brought to her by her steward, a trusted slave or freedman called a villicus if he manages a rural estate, or simply a household manager if his responsibilities are more domestic. This morning's tablets concern a shipment of wine that left 3 days ago from a port on the coast, bound for Ostia, the great harbour town that fed Rome itself, and Aurelia owns a share, a meaningful share, in both the vineyard that produced it and the small merchant vessel carrying it. Roman aristocratic convention technically frowned on senators engaging directly and visibly in trade, a prejudice that pushed a great deal of commercial activity into exactly the kind of arrangement Aurelia has built. Structured through freedmen acting as her agents, her name kept formally at a slight, socially acceptable distance from the actual grubby business of buying and selling, while the profits flowed quite directly into her own accounts. This is worth pausing on, because it explains so much about how women like Aurelia and Livia and countless others whose names survive only as a stamp pressed into fired clay, managed to build such substantial fortunes while still operating inside a society that officially considered direct commercial hustle beneath a respectable woman's dignity. The freedman, a former slave who had been formally manumitted, occupied a strange, useful middle position in Roman society. He was no longer enslaved, but he remained bound to his former owner, now his patron, through a web of social and legal obligations that Romans called clientela, obligations that in practice meant a freedman would often spend the rest of his working life managing his patron's business affairs, appearing publicly as the face of transactions that were, underneath, entirely directed by someone else. A wealthy woman could own a workshop that produced pottery, or a bakery, or a fleet of small trading vessels, and never once appear in the marketplace herself, haggling over prices. Her freedman did that. He signed the contracts, at least nominally, negotiated with suppliers, argued with customs officials at the harbour, while she reviewed his reports at her writing desk, approved or rejected his proposals, and kept, always, the final financial authority. It is not so different, honestly, from how a modern investor might hold a controlling stake in a business without ever setting foot on the factory floor, except that the intermediary here was often a person who had once been legally owned by the very woman now trusting him with her fortune, a relationship layered with debts of gratitude and obligation on both sides that we can only partially reconstruct from the outside now. Domitia Lucilla, whom I mentioned earlier only in passing, gives us one of the clearest windows into exactly this kind of arrangement, and I think she deserves a proper introduction because her name is attached to some of the most extensive brick production in Roman history. She was the mother of the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, and she inherited through her own family line enormous brickworks around Rome, operations so large and so consistently productive that her stamped bricks turn up constantly in excavations used in construction projects across the city for decades. Her son grew up to write the Meditations, one of the most quietly influential philosophical texts in Western history, a book much concerned with duty, restraint, and the proper use of one's position in the world. It is a small, satisfying historical irony that the philosopher-emperor who preached so much about simplicity and discipline was raised inside a household built, quite literally, on an industrial fortune managed for years by his mother, a woman whose brickyards were producing thousands upon thousands of stamped tiles and blocks while he was still a boy learning his letters. Brick production, if you have never thought about it before, was genuinely one of the great, unglamorous engines of Roman wealth. Rome rebuilt itself constantly after fires, after floods, after the endless churn of new construction that any growing imperial capital demands, and every single one of those buildings needed fired clay brick and tile in staggering quantities. The stamps pressed into wet clay before firing were not decorative. They were a kind of proto-industrial quality control and ownership record, identifying the estate, sometimes the specific workshop, sometimes the consular year the brick was fired in, allowing archaeologists today to date entire buildings with remarkable precision purely from the bricks buried in their walls. And a striking number of those stamps, when you start actually reading through the surviving corpus, carry women's names. Not as a rare curiosity, but as a genuinely recurring pattern, wealthy Roman women who inherited estates with brickworks attached, and who kept those operations running generation after generation, their names quietly baked, in the most literal sense possible, into the walls of the ancient world. There is another business Roman women engaged in that tends to surprise people even more than brickmaking, and that is money lending. Roman law, somewhat famously, developed a specific rule called the senatus consultum velianum, passed sometime in the 1st century, which forbade women from acting as guarantors or sureties for other people's debts, a restriction the Romans themselves justified by claiming women lacked sufficient understanding of legal and financial affairs to be trusted with that particular kind of obligation. It is worth sitting with the strangeness of that law for a moment, because it existed at the exact same time that women across the empire were independently running brickyards, shipping interests, and public building projects. The law was not really protecting women from their own supposed incompetence. It was protecting male relatives and business partners from women who had grown skilled enough at finance that men occasionally tried to push financial liability onto them, using a wife's or mother's assets as convenient cover for a risky loan, and the law existed largely to close off that specific abuse. And here is what I find genuinely fascinating about it. The restriction applied to acting as a guarantor for someone else's debt. It did not stop a woman from lending her own money directly, at interest in her own name. Papyrus records from Roman Egypt, an unusually well-preserved corner of the empire thanks to its dry climate, which has given us thousands of everyday legal and financial documents that simply rotted away everywhere else, show women lending grain, lending cash, charging interest, drawing up formal loan contracts with named witnesses, pursuing repayment through the local courts when a borrower fell behind. These are not glamorous documents. They are the ancient equivalent of a stack of boring paperwork sitting in a filing cabinet, and that is exactly what makes them so valuable, because nobody was performing wealth or status for these records. They were simply doing business, the way anyone with capital and an eye for a reasonable interest rate might do business in any century. Aurelia, in our story tonight, keeps a modest but active money-lending practice alongside her shipping and property interests, mostly small loans to local shopkeepers and craftsmen who need capital to expand a workshop or cover the gap between buying raw materials and selling finished goods. She charges a rate that would have seemed entirely ordinary by Roman standards, though it would raise eyebrows in a modern bank, since interest rates across the Roman world varied wildly by period and region, sometimes reaching levels a modern regulator would call predatory, though local custom and law placed real limits on the worst excesses, at least in principle. She keeps her records meticulously in a small strongbox in her private study, wax tablets bound together with cord, each one recording a name, a sum, a date, and a witness, because a debt without a witness in Roman practice was a debt very difficult to enforce if a dispute ever landed in front of a magistrate. I want to pull back for a moment here and let something settle, because I think it is easy, moving quickly through examples the way we have been, to lose the emotional shape of what all this actually meant for a woman living inside it. Imagine having genuine, defensible financial independence in a world that told you constantly, in 1,000 small daily ways, that you were not fully capable of managing your own affairs. Every legal document Aurelia signs technically requires the notional approval of a guardian, though by her era that guardian's actual power to block her decisions has worn down to something close to ceremonial. Every public inscription she might fund still tends to name her in relation to a father or a husband or a son, even when the money is entirely unambiguously her own. She lives, in other words, inside a persistent, low-grade friction between what she actually controls and what the culture around her insists on saying out loud about who controls it. That friction never fully disappears across the whole span of Roman history. It simply becomes, for women like her, something to work around rather than something to fight head-on. A kind of quiet, patient competence that speaks through brick stamps and building inscriptions and account ledgers rather than through direct confrontation. Let me slow down here for a while, because I want to spend some real time on the physical objects a wealthy Roman woman actually wore and touched, and kept close to her body, since I think that is where wealth stops being an abstract legal concept and becomes something you can almost feel against your own skin, listening in the dark. Aurelia keeps her jewellery in a small wooden box lined with a soft cloth, kept inside a larger strongbox in her bedroom. and on an ordinary morning, before any special occasion, she wears relatively little of it. A single pair of gold earrings, perhaps a plain gold ring, the rest saved for moments when display actually matters. A dinner with guests whose opinion of her household's standing carries real social weight. A public religious festival where the whole city will be watching who wears what. This restraint is itself a kind of Roman fashion logic that modern people sometimes miss. Excessive jewelry worn constantly, without occasion, could actually read as slightly vulgar, slightly try-hard, the visual equivalent of a person who cannot stop talking about how much money they have. The truly wealthy Roman woman, at least by the more austere strand of Roman social taste, understood that restraint, deployed correctly, communicated more confidence than constant display ever could. But when she does dress for an occasion, the materials involved are worth lingering on slowly, one at a time. Gold obviously worked into earrings, necklaces, bracelets, hairpins, sometimes hammered thin enough to be sewn directly onto the fabric of a garment as small decorative discs that would catch lamplight and scatter it across a room as she moved. Pearls, extraordinarily prized, imported at enormous cost from the Red Sea and the waters around India, valued so highly that the elder Pliny, writing his enormous encyclopedic natural history in the 1st century, complains at length about Roman women's obsession with them, describing with visible disapproval how a single pair of pearl earrings might cost as much as a substantial estate. How women wore them not just at the ears but sewn onto slippers, so that even the ground beneath a wealthy woman's feet carried a fortune most people would never see, and could not have afforded to look at directly, so to speak. Emeralds arrived from Egyptian mines, their green so saturated it seemed, to Roman eyes almost unnaturally alive, and there was a persistent Roman belief recorded by several ancient writers that looking at an emerald could actually soothe tired eyes, which meant wealthy Romans sometimes kept polished emerald stones simply to gaze at, an ancient version of a stress object, cool and green and expensive in the palm of a hand. Garnets, carnelian, amethyst, all worked by gem cutters into intaglios, small engraved seal stones set into rings, used to press a personal identifying mark into wax when sealing a letter or a legal document, meaning a wealthy woman's ring was not purely decorative but functional, a tool of business and correspondence she likely used almost every single day, the stone worn smooth at the edges from years of pressing into warm wax. And then there is the material that, more than any other, marked the very top tier of Roman wealth, more prized even than gold in certain specific contexts, Tyrian purple dye, extracted through an appallingly laborious process from the mucus glands of a particular species of sea snail, murex, harvested by the tens of thousands from the eastern Mediterranean coast, crushed, salted, and left to ferment in vats whose smell, by every ancient account that mentions it, was genuinely horrendous, a stench so intense that purple dye works were required by law in some cities to be located outside the city walls entirely. It took an extraordinary number of snails, sometimes estimated in the range of thousands, to produce even a single ounce of usable dye, which meant a garment genuinely deeply saturated in true Tyrian purple could cost more than its own weight in gold. Aurelia does not own a fully purple garment. Almost nobody outside the imperial family and the very highest ranks of the senatorial class did, since sumptuary customs and, at various points, actual legal restrictions limited who could wear full purple at all. But she owns a formal stola with a purple border, a stripe of that impossibly expensive colour running along its hem, a visible, unmistakable signal to anyone who understood the code that here was a household with money enough to burn on dye alone. Beneath the jewellery and the dyed cloth, there was another entire economy built around the Roman woman's body, quieter, more intimate, conducted mostly behind closed doors, and I mean the vast and surprisingly sophisticated world of Roman cosmetics and perfume, an industry that shows up constantly in the archaeological record, in small glass and ceramic jars pulled from bathrooms and bedrooms across the empire. Their contents long since evaporated, but their shapes and residues still telling us exactly what they once held. A wealthy Roman woman's dressing table, if we can even call it that. since the Romans did not always use a single dedicated piece of furniture the way later eras would, held an array of preparations that would not feel entirely foreign to a modern person browsing a cosmetics counter. A base of white lead called cerussa, ground into a fine powder and mixed with other substances to lighten and even out the complexion, since pale, unblemished skin signaled a life spent indoors, away from the sun, away from manual labor, the same visual logic of leisure and status that shows up again and again across so many different historical periods we have talked about on this channel before. The tragedy embedded in that particular cosmetic, and I do not want to gloss over it, is that white lead was genuinely, seriously toxic, absorbed slowly through the skin over years of use, contributing to health problems the Romans themselves could not have properly diagnosed or connected back to their own cosmetics chest. Red pigment, sometimes derived from ochre, sometimes from more exotic and expensive sources, was worked into the cheeks and lips. Kohl, made from soot or from ground antimony, was applied around the eyes with a small bronze or bone applicator. The same basic gesture, honestly, that a modern woman makes every single morning with a completely different set of tools. Perfume, though, is where I think the sensory world of a wealthy Roman woman becomes most vivid, most easy to actually imagine. Roman perfumers, working in specific well-known production centers, particularly around Capua in southern Italy, developed elaborate scented oils built from a base of olive oil or animal fat, infused slowly with flowers and resins, since the technology for distilling pure essential oils in the way a modern perfumer would did not yet exist. Rose was probably the single most popular scent, grown in enormous quantities specifically for the perfume trade, its petals pressed and steeped repeatedly to build up concentration. But the truly expensive scents reached far beyond the rose garden. Frankincense and myrrh carried by camel caravan from Arabia, along a trade route so lucrative it shaped the political fortunes of entire kingdoms along its length. Cinnamon and spikenard brought from India, their prices inflated by every middleman along a supply chain that stretched, quite literally, thousands of miles from source to a Roman woman's dressing table. Aurelia keeps her perfumed oils in small glass vessels, some no bigger than your thumb, their glass blown thin and delicate, sometimes tinted a pale blue or green from mineral impurities in the sand used to make them. Since fully clear, colourless glass remained a costly technical achievement for much of the Roman period. She applies a scented oil to her wrists, to the base of her throat, to the inside of her elbows. The same intuitive logic modern perfume application still follows. Pulse points where body warmth would gently release the fragrance throughout the day. And here is a small human detail I genuinely love. Roman writers occasionally complain, with the same mild, familiar exasperation you might hear from someone describing an overly perfumed relative today, about women who applied too much scent, layering rose over myrrh over some exotic imported oil, until the combined effect became less an elegant fragrance and more an overwhelming cloud that preceded a woman into a room by several full steps. Some things, it turns out, really do not change very much across 2,000 years. Let us step back into the house now, because none of what Aurelia owns, none of the perfume or the purple-bordered stola or the account tablets recording loans and shipping shares, functions without an enormous, largely invisible apparatus of labour holding the whole structure upright. And I think it would be dishonest to talk about wealthy Roman women tonight without spending real time on the people whose work made that wealth visible and usable. A household like Aurelia's might include anywhere from a handful to several dozen slaves, depending on her exact fortune, and their roles were extraordinarily specialised. Far more so than a modern person might assume from the flattened, generic word slave alone. There was the ornatrix we mentioned earlier, whose entire skill set revolved around hairdressing, a craft demanding enough that a genuinely talented ornatrix could become a valuable, sometimes even sentimentally cherished member of a household. Her fingers trained over years to build the elaborate tiered hairstyles fashionable at any given moment. Styles that changed with the same restless unpredictability as any modern trend, meaning an ornatrix also had to stay current, informed, aware of what was being worn in the households that mattered. There were slaves trained specifically as scribes, literate, sometimes more literate than the family members they served, responsible for copying letters, managing correspondence, occasionally even handling household accounts under a steward's direction. There were cooks, whose skill could vary from basic and functional to genuinely artistic, since a wealthy household's reputation rested partly on the quality of food served to guests, and a truly gifted cook, again, might become a prized, valuable asset within the household economy. And then there was the villicus if the family held rural land, a role we touched on briefly earlier that deserves a slightly fuller picture, because he functioned essentially as an estate manager, frequently a slave himself, though sometimes a freedman, responsible for overseeing agricultural production, managing the enslaved and free laborers who actually worked the fields, coordinating harvests, negotiating with buyers and reporting back to the owner, who might visit the estate only occasionally, preferring to live in town and simply collect the results of the villicus's labor. Roman agricultural writers, particularly a man named Columella who wrote an extensive treatise on farming in the 1st century, actually devote real attention to the villica, the female counterpart, often the villicus's own wife, who managed the domestic side of a rural estate, overseeing food preservation, wool production, the health of the household, and the discipline of the enslaved women working under her. It is a strange, uncomfortable thing to sit with, honestly, a woman managing other women's labor within a system that held all of them, mistress and worker alike, inside deeply unequal structures of power, though the specific shape of that inequality obviously differed enormously depending on which side of it you occupied. I do not want to move past this too quickly because it matters, and I think a story about wealth that skips lightly over the labor beneath it is not really being honest with you. Roman slavery was not a gentle institution dressed up in nicer clothes than other historical forms of bondage. Enslaved people could be bought, sold, physically punished, and had no legal standing of their own, no matter how skilled or trusted or, in some individual cases, genuinely valued by the household they served. The fact that a slave might rise through skill and loyalty to manage substantial responsibility, or that a freedman might eventually run his former owner's shipping business with real autonomy, does not erase the brutal legal reality underneath those relationships. What it does show, I think, is how thoroughly Roman wealth, at every single level we have discussed tonight, from Livia's brickyards to Aurelia's modest money lending, rested on a foundation of coerced human labor that made the whole visible structure of jewelry and perfume and marble buildings possible in the first place. The gold on Aurelia's fingers came from mines worked, in many cases, by enslaved laborers under conditions ancient writers themselves sometimes described with visible unease. The purple border on her stola existed because someone, almost certainly enslaved or desperately poor and free in name only, spent long days standing over fermenting vats of crushed sea snails in a stench strong enough to be legally banished from city walls. Wealth in Rome, as in so many places across history, was never a story about money alone. It was always, underneath, a story about whose labor that money represented. There is a strange and lovely contradiction sitting right at the center of Roman domestic ideology that I want to bring into the room now, because it touches Aurelia directly, and it says something quietly important about how Rome liked to imagine its wealthy women, even while those same women were running brickyards and lending money at interest. The single most praised, most idealized virtue a Roman matron could possess, according to funerary inscriptions repeated across the empire with almost formulaic regularity, was that she was lanum fetit. She worked wool. Think about that for a moment against everything we have just spent the last half hour discussing. A woman who might personally control a fortune worth more than most senators, who might own ships and brickworks and lend money to half the shopkeepers on her street, was still, in the epitaph her own family chose to carve into her tombstone, most likely to be remembered first and foremost for spinning and weaving wool, the most basic, most traditional domestic labor imaginable, associated since the earliest days of the Republic with old-fashioned feminine virtue, modesty, and devotion to the household. Even the most famous, most idealized woman of early Roman legend, Lucretia, whose suicide after being assaulted supposedly helped trigger the fall of the monarchy and the birth of the Republic itself, is specifically found by her husband and his companions, according to the historian Livia, sitting up late at night with her attendants, working wool by lamplight, a detail Livia includes precisely because it signals her impeccable virtue before anything else happens in the story. Wealthy Roman households, quite genuinely, often maintained working looms, and Roman writers describe upper-class women, or at least the women whose reputations their families wanted, carefully managed, spinning thread and directing the weaving of household textiles, even when the actual bulk of a family's cloth almost certainly came from purchased fabric or from slaves doing the heavy daily labor of production. The woolworking in a genuinely wealthy household had become something closer to a symbolic gesture than an economic necessity, a performance of old-fashioned virtue maintained precisely because the family no longer strictly needed it, the way a modern wealthy family might keep a vegetable garden, not because they need the food, but because it signals a particular kind of grounded, wholesome identity they want associated with their name. Aurelia keeps a loom in a room near the atrium, and she does in fact spin thread herself some evenings, sitting with her daughters and a couple of trusted household women, the distaff and spindle turning in her hands with the easy, practiced rhythm of a skill learned in childhood and never entirely lost, even as her actual daily labor has shifted almost entirely toward accounts and correspondence and the management of freedmen running her business interests. There is something almost touching in that image, honestly. A woman who spends her mornings reviewing shipping contracts and calculating interest on loans, and her evenings performing quite sincerely a piece of much older domestic identity that Roman culture never stopped demanding of her. Regardless of how much money moved through her hands during daylight hours, the wool did not pay for the ships. The ships paid for the wool to be a choice rather than a necessity, but the wool still mattered deeply to how she would be remembered. Let us walk further into the house now, past the atrium and its rain-fed pool, into the parts of a wealthy Roman domus that guests would only see once they had been formally welcomed, rather than merely received. Beyond the atrium, often through a narrow passage flanked by the small private rooms called cubicula, bedrooms really, though the word covers a broader range of quiet personal spaces than that simple translation suggests, the house opens again into a peristyle, a garden framed on all sides by a covered colonnade, columns holding up a shaded walkway that let you move around the garden's edge without stepping into direct sun or sudden rain. This is where a great deal of a wealthy household's genuine personal wealth quietly reveals itself, away from the more formal semi-public atrium at the front of the house. Fountains, sometimes elaborate, worked in bronze or marble, water trickling constantly through carved figures, filling the garden with a soft, continuous sound that Roman writers occasionally describe as genuinely soothing, an ancient version of exactly the kind of white noise you might use to fall asleep tonight. Frescoed walls, painted directly onto wet plaster by skilled artists, sometimes depicting garden scenes so lush and detailed that the painted foliage seemed to extend the actual planted garden outward into an impossible, permanently blooming extension of itself. Birds and fruit trees and flowering shrubs rendered in pigments ground from minerals imported at real expense, since a good blue pigment, made from crushed lapis lazuli or from an artificially manufactured compound the Romans called Egyptian blue, cost considerably more than a simple red or ochre. Off this garden, in the wealthiest households, you might find a small private bath suite, a genuine luxury that meant a family did not need to visit the enormous public bathhouses that most Romans, regardless of class, used as a matter of daily routine. A private bath required its own furnace, its own system of pipes and flues running heat beneath raised floors and through hollow spaces in the walls, a technology called a hypercost that Roman engineers had refined into something genuinely impressive, keeping bathing rooms warm even through a cold Italian winter. Aurelia's own house includes a modest version of this, not the sprawling multi-room bath suite of the truly imperial elite, but enough, a small heated room where she can bathe privately, attended by a slave whose entire job, that particular afternoon, is to scrape oil and accumulated dirt from her skin using a curved bronze tool called a strigil, since Romans did not use soap the way later cultures would, but instead oiled the skin, worked it, and then scraped the oil away along with whatever grime had loosened beneath it. And then past the garden, the triclinium, the formal dining room, named for the 3 couches, arranged in a horseshoe shape, on which guests reclined while eating, a low central table positioned within easy reach of all 3. This is where a wealthy Roman household's social life reached its most concentrated, most performative expression, and it is also where the position of women within that display shifted meaningfully across Roman history, in a way I think is worth pausing on properly, because it tells you something real about how attitudes toward women's public presence actually moved over time, rather than staying frozen in some single unchanging shape we can simply generalize about. In the earlier Republic, respectable Roman women, if they attended a formal dinner at all, generally sat upright on a chair positioned near the reclining men rather than lounging on a couch beside them, a posture that Roman moralizing tradition connected explicitly to modesty and self-control. Since reclining, associated with Greek dining customs the Romans regarded with a mix of admiration and suspicion, carried faint connotations of looseness, of a woman putting her body on display in a way considered inappropriate. Valerius Maximus, a Roman writer compiling moral anecdotes in the early 1st century, records the story of a woman supposedly put to death in the deep half-legendary past of early Rome, simply for having been caught drinking wine without her husband's knowledge, a story almost certainly exaggerated or invented for moral effect, but revealing precisely because of what it was invented to prove, that wine and women's bodily comportment at the dinner table carried enormous symbolic weight in the Roman imagination, weight far beyond the actual practical stakes involved. By Aurelia's time in the late 1st century, this had genuinely relaxed, at least among the wealthier, more socially confident households. Respectable married women did recline at dinner alongside their husbands and guests by this point, a shift ancient writers themselves comment on, sometimes approvingly, sometimes with the faint nostalgic disapproval older generations tend to bring to any change in custom. Aurelia hosts dinners regularly, and when she does, she reclines on the couch beside her husband, or, on the evenings when her husband is traveling on business and she hosts alone, she takes the position of honor herself, directing the evening's conversation and the sequence of courses with the same quiet, practiced authority she brings to reviewing shipping contracts. The food itself, on an evening meant to impress, moved through courses that a modern person would find both familiar and genuinely strange in roughly equal measure. An opening course, the gustatio, might include eggs, olives, and small savory dishes, meant to stimulate the appetite and give guests something to nibble while conversation warmed up. The main courses that followed could range from the fairly ordinary roasted meats, fresh fish brought up from the coast packed in ice cut from mountain snowfields and stored through summer in insulated pits, to the genuinely extravagant dishes built around exotic imported ingredients meant primarily to demonstrate reach and expense rather than simple flavor, since a wealthy host's dinner was never really only about the food. It was about proving, course by course, exactly how far her household's money and connections could stretch across the known world to bring something rare to the table. A final course of fruit and honeyed sweets closed the meal, along with wine, always wine, mixed with water in proportions Romans considered the mark of civilized drinking, since consuming wine unmixed, undiluted, was associated with barbarian excess rather than respectable Roman restraint. Servants moved constantly through the room during a dinner like this, refilling cups, clearing dishes, bringing water and small towels for guests to wipe their hands, since Romans ate largely with their fingers, reclining on one elbow, reaching forward to select food from shared dishes rather than working through individually plated courses the way a modern formal dinner would organize things. It was, by every account that survives, a genuinely social, genuinely physical way of eating, bodies close together on shared couches, hands touching shared food, conversation flowing in a room lit by oil lamps whose flickering light softened every hard edge in the frescoed walls around them, and Aurelia watching from her own couch, keeping half an eye on whether the wine was being mixed correctly, whether a particular guest's cup had gone empty for too long, was doing precisely the same quiet, attentive social labor that a good hostess in any century, in any culture, instinctively performs without ever quite naming it as labor at all. Let me take you back to the harbour for a moment, because I want to spend more time on the shipping side of Aurelia's fortune, since it is one of the more genuinely adventurous, genuinely risky corners of how wealthy Roman women grew and protected their money, and I think the risk itself deserves proper attention, because wealth built on the sea was never simple, passive income. It was a gamble renewed with every single voyage. The ship in which Aurelia holds her share is a modest merchant vessel, the kind Romans called a corbita, broad-bellied and slow, built for cargo capacity rather than speed, its hold currently packed with amphorae of wine sealed with clay stoppers and pitch to keep the contents from spoiling on the journey. Roman sea trade operated seasonally, largely shutting down entirely during the winter months when storms made the Mediterranean genuinely dangerous, a period called mare classum, the closed sea, when even the most confident captains generally kept their vessels in harbour rather than risk a crossing. This meant a merchant's entire year of profit or loss compressed into a handful of months between roughly March and November, a narrow window in which every voyage carried real financial stakes, since a single lost ship, wrecked in a sudden storm or seized by pirates, who remained a persistent, genuine threat despite Rome's famous naval campaigns to suppress them, could wipe out a season's investment entirely. To spread that risk, Roman investors, women very much included, often held partial shares in multiple ships rather than full ownership of a single vessel, exactly the kind of portfolio diversification a modern financial advisor would recognize immediately, even though the Romans never wrote it down using that particular vocabulary. Aurelia holds a share in 3 different vessels this season, one carrying wine, one carrying olive oil pressed on estates she partly owns further inland, and one, more speculatively, carrying a mixed cargo of pottery and small luxury goods bound for a port along the North African coast, a route that, if the ship arrives safely and finds good prices, could return a genuinely substantial profit, but which also carries a meaningfully higher risk than the well-worn, heavily trafficked route straight to Ostia. There is a particular kind of loan connected to this trade that I think is worth explaining properly, because it shows Roman financial thinking at its most genuinely sophisticated, a structure called fonus nauticum, maritime loan, or bottomry, in which a lender advanced money to a ship's captain or merchant specifically to fund a voyage, at an interest rate considerably higher than an ordinary land-based loan, but with a crucial condition attached. If the ship was lost at sea, the loan was simply forgiven entirely, the lender absorbing the loss rather than the borrower. It was, in other words, a form of insurance disguised as a loan, and it required real judgment to price correctly, since a lender had to weigh the elevated interest rate against a genuine assessment of the route's danger, the season, the reputation of the captain, the seaworthiness of the vessel itself. Aurelia has made loans of exactly this kind on occasion, and she reviews the details with real care, questioning the freedman who manages that side of her business about the captain's experience, about whether the vessel has been recently recalked, about the political situation along the North African coast this particular year, since piracy and local disruption could shift meaningfully from one season to the next. I find something genuinely moving in imagining her at this task, honestly a woman sitting in a quiet room lit by an oil lamp, weighing the fate of men she has likely never met, sailors and captains whose lives depend, in some small part, on the accuracy of her judgment about wind patterns and hull condition, and the temperament of a stretch of coastline she has never personally seen. Wealth at this level was never truly passive. It required a working knowledge of geography, of weather, of maritime law, of human character, knowledge Aurelia built the same way anyone builds real expertise, through years of watching outcomes, adjusting her judgment, learning from the voyages that failed as carefully as she studied the ones that succeeded. I want to widen the lens for a while now, away from Aurelia's particular household and out across the empire itself, because Roman wealth and Roman women's relationship to it did not look identical everywhere the empire's borders reached. It shifted, sometimes quite dramatically, depending on which older, pre-Roman culture a given province had absorbed Roman law into, and I think that variation is worth exploring slowly, since it is easy, telling a story like this one, to accidentally imply that all of Roman society moved as a single uniform block, when in reality it was closer to a loose, sprawling confederation of very different local customs, all technically operating under the same distant imperial legal framework. In Roman Egypt, women's legal and economic position looked genuinely distinctive, shaped by centuries of earlier Egyptian and then Greek Ptolemaic tradition layered underneath the newer Roman administrative structure imposed after the defeat of Cleopatra. Egyptian women, going back long before Roman rule arrived, had traditionally held property rights and legal standing considerably more direct than classical Roman custom generally allowed, and something of that older independence persisted, in practice well into the Roman period, visible in the extraordinary volume of surviving papyrus documents, marriage contracts, property deeds, tax records, court petitions, all preserved by Egypt's remarkably dry climate in a way that simply did not happen anywhere else in the empire. We have Egyptian women in these documents managing farmland directly, appearing in court to argue their own cases with a directness that would have raised eyebrows in Rome itself, negotiating marriage contracts that specify, in genuinely granular financial detail, exactly what property each spouse brings into the union and exactly what happens to it if the marriage dissolves. In North Africa, the region around Carthage and the fertile coastal cities that fed Rome with grain and olive oil, wealthy women appear repeatedly in the archaeological record as patrons of public building projects, their names carved into the facades of temples and civic structures across cities like Thugga and Lepsius Magna, funding baths, funding arches, funding the kind of grand public architecture that elsewhere tended to be almost exclusively a male senatorial pursuit. Some of this reflects the particular wealth of North Africa's olive oil trade, an industry that generated enormous fortunes for the landowning families who controlled the vast estates producing it, fortunes substantial enough that even the female heirs of these families could fund genuinely monumental architecture without straining the family's resources. In Gaul, in Britain, in the Rhineland provinces, the picture shifts again, shaped by the pre-existing Celtic and Germanic legal and social traditions that Roman administration layered its own structures over, rather than fully replacing. There is a genuinely striking body of evidence, funerary monuments particularly, from these northern provinces, showing wealthy women commemorated with real prominence, sometimes depicted with the tools and symbols of their own trade or profession carved directly into the stone. A woman shown with the instruments of a physician, another shown surrounded by symbols connected to textile production, on a scale suggesting genuine commercial enterprise rather than purely domestic household work. Some historians connect this partly to pre-Roman Celtic tradition, in which women in certain tribal contexts had held property and even, in a few striking documented cases, political leadership roles that classical Mediterranean culture would have found genuinely startling, the most famous example being Boudica, the British queen who led a massive, nearly successful rebellion against Roman rule in the year 61, a woman whose wealth and authority within her own tribe long predated any Roman legal category, trying to explain or contain it. I mention all of this partly because I think it is honest, and partly because I think it makes the whole picture richer rather than tidier. which is, I would argue, exactly what real history should do to a story the longer you sit with it. Aurelia's world, the world of sine manu marriage and dowries and Roman brick stamps, was the dominant legal framework across the empire, but it was never the only current running underneath the surface. Wherever Rome expanded, it absorbed as much as it imposed, and wealthy women across those different provinces navigated a shifting, layered blend of Roman law and older local custom, each finding her own particular route through it toward whatever measure of independence and security the combination allowed her to build. Let me linger a little longer on the funerary inscriptions, because I think they are, in the end, the single most honest source we have for understanding how Roman society actually wanted to remember its wealthy women. More honest in a strange way than any law code, since a law code tells you what the state permitted, while a tombstone tells you what a grieving family actually chose to say freely about the person they had lost. Roman funerary monuments follow a set of loose but recognizable conventions, usually recording a name, an age at death, sometimes strikingly precise, down to the exact number of years, months, and days. A habit that always strikes me as quietly moving, the specific arithmetic of grief carved into stone by someone still counting. Beyond the basic facts, an inscription might record a woman's relationships, daughter of, wife of, mother of, and then often a handful of praised qualities: chastity, devotion to her husband, modesty, and, again and again, that recurring reference to woolworking we discussed earlier. A formula so common across the Roman world that historians studying thousands of these inscriptions have been able to trace exactly how frequently certain phrases repeat, almost like a template families reached for because it said, efficiently and respectably, exactly what was expected to be said. But scattered among those more formulaic inscriptions are others that break the pattern in ways that tell us something real. A woman commemorated not primarily for her domestic virtue but for her professional skill, a midwife whose tombstone specifically celebrates the number of successful deliveries she attended, a detail that suggests her family, and perhaps the wider community that remembered her, valued that professional accomplishment enough to have it carved permanently into stone rather than the more expected language of modesty and chastity. A woman remembered as a purpuraria, a dealer in that extraordinarily expensive purple dye we discussed earlier, her trade specifically named on her monument, a small proud declaration that she had built something real in a genuinely lucrative and competitive market. A woman remembered as a negotiatrix, a female merchant or businesswoman, a term that shows up often enough across the surviving inscriptions that it clearly represented a recognized, if not universally common, category of Roman female identity, women whose families, at the moment of final commemoration, when every word had to be chosen carefully because stone does not forgive a bad decision the way a passing remark might, decided that trade, that commerce, that hard-won professional competence deserved to be the thing remembered. I keep coming back to one particular inscription, recovered from Rome itself, commemorating a woman named Aurelia Tyche, actually from Pompeii rather than Rome, whose funerary monument, one of the more elaborate surviving examples from that city, shows her not simply named but depicted in relief carving, seated formally, dignified, surrounded by imagery connected to her family's evident wealth and civic standing, a monument she apparently had built during her own lifetime for herself and her husband, a freedman who had risen to genuine local prominence. There is something quietly extraordinary in that act alone, a woman commissioning her own memorial before her death, deciding with real deliberateness exactly how she wanted to be remembered by everyone who would walk past that tomb along the road leading out of the city for centuries afterward. Long after anyone who had actually known her was gone, she was choosing her own last word in a conversation she knew perfectly well she would not be present to continue. That detail has stayed with me since I first read about her, honestly, because it captures something true about wealth that goes beyond ships and brickyards and interest rates. Money, at its most basic and most human level, buys the ability to shape how you are remembered, and Aurelia Tyche, a former slave's wife who had climbed, through her own family's effort and a fair amount of luck, into genuine local prominence, used that ability with real intention, carving her own dignity permanently into stone, rather than leaving it to chance, or to whatever brief, half-remembered version of her a grieving relative might have improvised in a moment of grief. Let me back up now before we return to the quiet close of Aurelia's evening and talk about where all of this actually began for a wealthy Roman girl, because wealth did not simply appear in a woman's hands at the moment of marriage. It was built deliberately from childhood onward, through education, through negotiation, through a dowry whose exact terms could shape the entire remaining trajectory of her financial life. The daughter born into a family with real money received an education that, while never quite matching the formal rhetorical training given to her brothers, was often considerably more substantial than popular imagination tends to assume. She learnt to read and write, generally taught first at home by a tutor, sometimes a trusted educated slave, sometimes hired specifically for the purpose, and for a wealthy family, that tutor might well be teaching Greek alongside Latin, since fluency in Greek, the language of philosophy and literature and, frankly, of sophisticated conversation among the Roman elite, was considered an essential marker of genuine cultivation. She learnt arithmetic, practical enough to manage household accounts later in life, and she learnt, depending on her family's particular taste and resources, music, sometimes the lyre, sometimes singing, skills valued partly for their own sake and partly because a woman who could perform gracefully at a dinner party added real social currency to her household's reputation. Some Roman girls received an education that went considerably further than this basic foundation. We know of women who wrote poetry that circulated and was genuinely admired, women who corresponded with philosophers, women whose letters, in the rare cases where fragments survive, show a genuine command of rhetorical structure and argument that had clearly been deliberately cultivated rather than picked up incidentally. This mattered enormously for our story tonight, because a woman who could read a contract closely, who could follow the mathematics of an interest calculation, who could compose a clear, persuasive letter to a business partner or a magistrate, was simply better equipped to manage substantial wealth than one who could not, and wealthy Roman families, whatever their broader cultural assumptions about women's proper sphere, were often shrewd enough to recognize that a well-educated daughter was a genuinely more valuable asset, in every sense of that word, than a poorly educated one. Marriage itself, for a girl from a wealthy family, was rarely a matter of personal romantic choice, at least not in its earliest arrangement, which typically involved careful negotiation between the two families, the father acting as the primary negotiator, weighing the social standing, the financial resources, and the political connections a prospective husband's family could offer against what his own daughter and her dowry brought to the arrangement in return. The dowry negotiation itself could be genuinely intricate, involving not just a lump sum of cash, but sometimes land, sometimes slaves, sometimes shares in an ongoing business venture, all carefully documented, since, as we discussed earlier, Roman law increasingly protected a wife's right to have that dowry returned if the marriage ended, meaning both families had a strong practical incentive to get the paperwork exactly right from the very beginning. Roman girls typically married younger than we might expect today, sometimes in their early teens, particularly among the aristocracy where political alliances often demanded marriages arranged well before a girl had reached full physical maturity, though the marriage itself, the actual consummation and cohabitation, was frequently delayed somewhat until she was a little older. It is worth sitting honestly with how young this often was, because it is easy, telling a story focused on financial independence and business acumen, to accidentally romanticize a system that also, undeniably, subjected very young girls to marriages arranged entirely for the benefit of their father's political and economic interests, with little regard, in many documented cases, for what the girl herself might have wanted. The financial independence sine manu marriage, eventually granted a Roman wife, did not erase the fact that the marriage itself, at its origin, was rarely something she had chosen freely. Both things were true simultaneously. The system that constrained her, and the system that, once she was inside it, sometimes allowed her to build genuine autonomy within its boundaries. Wealth, for all its genuine power, could not protect a Roman woman from one of the greatest dangers her life reliably held, and I think it would be incomplete to talk about her world tonight without acknowledging it honestly, gently, the way you might acknowledge a hard truth to a friend rather than dwelling on it. Childbirth in the Roman world was genuinely dangerous for wealthy and poor women alike, and funerary inscriptions across the empire record, with a quiet, repeated regularity that is hard to read without feeling something, young wives who died in their late teens or early 20s, often alongside a note that the infant died as well, or, sometimes more painfully still, survived a mother who did not live to see it grow. A wealthy household could afford better food, cleaner water, more attentive care during pregnancy, and could summon a trained midwife, sometimes several, along with, in the households that could reach for it, an actual physician, since Roman medicine, drawing heavily on Greek tradition, had developed genuine expertise in obstetrics, recorded in surviving texts by writers like Cyrannus of Ephesus, whose treatise on gynecology, written in the early 2nd century, shows a level of careful, systematic observation that would not feel entirely out of place in a much later era of medicine. But none of that expertise came close to modern medical safety, and complications that a contemporary hospital would manage routinely, breech presentations, hemorrhage, prolonged and obstructed labor, remained genuinely life-threatening, regardless of how much money stood behind the mother in the birthing room. This shaped Roman family life in ways that are easy to overlook when we focus purely on business ledgers and brick stamps. A wealthy widower, having lost a young wife in childbirth, would often remarry fairly quickly, sometimes within the same year, a pattern that can look, from a modern emotional vantage point, almost coldly practical, but which reflected a society in which marriage functioned simultaneously as an emotional bond and as an essential economic and social institution that a household, particularly one with young children already needing care, could not easily leave unattended for long. Remarriage, for a wealthy widow herself, if she survived her husband rather than the reverse, was similarly common, though here the dynamic shifted, since a widow who had inherited real property and who was past the age when a guardian's formal oversight carried much practical weight, sometimes chose not to remarry at all, preferring the genuine independence widowhood granted her over the renewed legal entanglement, however light it had become by her era, that a new marriage would introduce. Livia herself, interestingly, never remarried after Augustus died, spending her final 15 years as one of the most powerful widows in the history of the ancient world, her fortune and her influence entirely her own to direct, answerable to no husband at all. Umidia Quadratilla, whom we met earlier watching her own gladiators perform into her final year of life, appears to have spent decades of her own long widowhood managing her considerable estate exactly as she pleased, a pattern historians have noted repeats often enough among wealthy Roman widows to suggest something genuinely significant, that widowhood for a woman who had already secured her financial independence could function less as a tragedy to be endured and more as the single freest, most fully self-directed period of her entire life. A strange, quiet inversion of how we sometimes assume widowhood must have felt in a historical period this distant and, on its surface, this rigidly patriarchal. I want to bring a few more imperial women into this story before we settle back into Aurelia's quiet evening, because the pattern we have traced through Livia repeats, with real variation, across the following centuries, and I think it deserves a proper look, since these women shaped how enormous amounts of Roman wealth actually moved through the empire, funding buildings and charitable programs that touched people who never once saw the inside of an imperial palace. Plotina, wife of the Emperor Trajan who reigned in the early 2nd century, took a genuinely active role in imperial administration, corresponding directly with provincial governors on matters of policy, and she is remembered by contemporary sources for advocating, with apparent sincerity, for financial restraint and careful management of public funds, a reputation for fiscal seriousness that stood in notable contrast to some of the more extravagant imperial women history remembers. After Trajan's death, she remained close to his successor Hadrian, and inscriptions and coins from her lifetime show her honored with a directness and formal prominence that suggests her influence over imperial policy was recognized as genuinely substantial, not merely symbolic. Later still, in the early 3rd century, Julia Domna, wife of the Emperor Septimius Severus, presided over what ancient sources describe as an intellectual circle, gathering philosophers and writers around her, commissioning at least one surviving biography of the philosopher Apollonius of Tyana, and wielding through the reigns of both her husband and, after his death, her son Caracalla, a level of political influence significant enough that she effectively managed portions of imperial administration during military campaigns that kept the emperor away from Rome for extended periods. She came from a prominent Syrian family, her father a high priest in the city of Emesa, and her rise to the very center of Roman imperial power is a genuine reminder that Rome's elite, by this period, drew wealth and influence from across an enormously diverse empire, not simply from old Italian aristocratic bloodlines. Beyond the imperial household, the broader Roman practice of wealthy public benefaction, a pattern historians call euagetism, drawing on a Greek word meaning good works, gave women across the empire a consistent, socially celebrated outlet for exactly the kind of large-scale public spending we saw Eumachia and Numidia Quadratilla engage in. A wealthy woman funding a public bath, a temple, a stretch of aqueduct, a festival, or, in some particularly striking recorded cases, a program distributing free grain or oil to the poor of her city during a famine or shortage, received public honors in return, sometimes a formal decree from the local town council, sometimes a statue erected in her honor in the forum, sometimes simply the enduring inscription carved into whatever structure her money had built. This exchange, money for honor, wealth for public memory, gave Roman women one of the very few avenues through which they could achieve something functionally close to the kind of public political recognition that office holding, formally closed to them, would otherwise have provided. A woman could not become a magistrate, but she could fund the very building in which the magistrates conducted their business, and have her own name carved above the door, larger in some surviving cases than any name belonging to the men who actually held the office inside. There were other priesthoods beyond the Vestals that gave wealthy Roman women a formal, publicly recognized religious role, and Eumachia's own title, public priestess, that we glimpsed earlier carved into the stone of her building in Pompeii, points toward exactly this wider world. Many Roman towns maintained a priesthood dedicated to the imperial cult, the formal religious veneration of the emperor and his family, and women from locally prominent families frequently held the female version of this office, sometimes called a flaminica, responsible for overseeing rituals, sacrifices, and public ceremonies connected to the imperial household's divine or semi-divine standing. This was not a minor decorative honor. It came with genuine civic visibility, a formal seat at public ceremonies, and, often, an expectation that the woman holding the position would personally fund at least part of the public festivities associated with it. Feasts, games, distributions of food or money to the citizenry, exactly the kind of expenditure that folded neatly back into the broader pattern of wealthy public benefaction we just discussed. There were also the more intimate, women-only religious traditions that ran alongside these public honors, most famously the rites of the goddess Bona Dea, the good goddess, whose annual December ceremony, held in the home of a serving Roman magistrate, excluded men so completely that the scandal of a man, the young political operator Publius Clodius Pulcher, allegedly sneaking into the ceremony disguised as a woman in the year 62, before our era became one of the most notorious political controversies of the entire late Republic, eventually contributing to the very unrest that would later shape Fulvia's own turbulent life, since Clodius, remarkably, would go on to become her first husband. The Bona Dea rites were led by the senior woman of whichever household hosted them that year, assisted by the Vestal virgins themselves, and involved wine, though referred to euphemistically during the ceremony as milk, a detail ancient writers found genuinely amusing, given how firmly Roman public morality otherwise insisted respectable women avoided wine altogether. And further east, as the empire expanded and absorbed religious traditions from Egypt and the Near East, the worship of Isis spread across the Roman world with real popularity, particularly interestingly among women, offering a goddess whose mythology centered on devoted love, on searching for and restoring a lost husband, on maternal protection, themes that clearly resonated deeply within households navigating exactly the marriages, widowhoods, and family losses we have spent tonight exploring. Wealthy Roman women funded temples to Isis, held priestly roles within her worship, and the archaeological remains of Isis temples across the Mediterranean, from Pompeii to Rome itself, show a religious community in which women held a level of formal, visible leadership that the more traditional core of Roman civic religion, however many priestesshoods it technically offered, rarely matched in its everyday texture and warmth. It is evening now, back in Aurelia's house, and the dinner guests, if there were any tonight, have gone home, carried off through darkened streets by torchlight, their slaves walking ahead with small oil lamps to pick out the uneven paving stones beneath their feet. The triclinium has been cleared, the couches straightened, the last of the wine poured out or covered for tomorrow, and the house has settled into that particular late-hour quiet that every home in every century seems to share, a quiet that is not silence exactly, but a lowering, a softening, the sound of a household exhaling. Aurelia makes her way toward the small private bath off the peristyle, where a single slave waits with warmed water and oil, since a full public bathhouse visit belongs to the afternoon hours, when Roman social life genuinely centered around the great communal baths. But a quiet, private evening rinse belongs to this later, softer hour, a small luxury reserved for households wealthy enough to heat water twice in a single day without a second thought. The room is warm from the hypocaust beneath the floor, warm enough that stepping onto the tiles barefoot brings no shock of cold, and the single oil lamp set into a wall niche throws a low, steady amber light across the painted plaster, a small scene of dolphins and sea creatures curling around the walls, faded now from years of steam and use, but still in this dim light, quietly beautiful. She sits while the slave works oil into her skin and then draws it away again with the curved bronze strigil, a slow, repetitive motion, and I think, honestly, that this particular ritual, more than almost anything else in her day, must have felt something like what a warm bath still feels like to any of us tonight. A physical unwinding that arrives at the exact moment the mind is finally ready to stop working. The accounts are closed for the day, the wax tablets are stacked and locked away in the strongbox in her study, the loan due next month from a shopkeeper 2 streets over, the shipping contract for the vessel bound for the North African coast, the brickyards' monthly production report from the freedman who manages it on her behalf. All of it set aside now, waiting quietly for morning. Her hair, unpinned by the ornatrex earlier and left loose for the evening, falls around her shoulders, and there is something almost startling, if you sit with the image for a moment, in imagining how different she looks right now from the carefully constructed public version of herself that moved through the forum and the harbour and the dinner table earlier today. The elaborate architecture of curls is gone. The purple-bordered stola hangs in a wooden chest in her bedroom. The rings are back in their small cloth-lined box. What remains in this low lamplight, in this warm, quiet room, is simply a woman, tired in the particular satisfied way that comes from a long day of genuine, competent work, her mind already beginning to loosen its grip on the day's obligations and drift, gently, toward whatever waits for her in sleep. She thinks before she goes to bed about her daughter, 12 years old now, already learning to read Greek alongside Latin from the household tutor, already beginning to understand, in the slow, half-conscious way children absorb the shape of their own future, that she is being prepared for something more than simply becoming someone's wife. Aurelia has begun, quietly, teaching her daughter the basics of the household accounts, letting her sit nearby while the wax tablets are reviewed, explaining in small pieces appropriate to a child's patience how interest is calculated, how a shipping contract is structured, how to read a freedman's report for the small inconsistencies that might signal either honest confusion or something less honest entirely. She does not know, of course, whether her daughter will marry into a household that allows her the same independence Aurelia herself has built. She cannot control that, not fully, not in a world still governed by fathers negotiating dowries and husbands whose own characters remain, until the marriage is actually underway, largely unknowable, but she can make sure her daughter understands the mechanics of wealth itself thoroughly, completely, so that whatever household she eventually manages, she will manage it the way Aurelia has managed her own, with clear eyes and a steady hand, rather than simply trusting whatever a husband or a steward chooses to tell her. Let me tell you about wills now, because I think there is something genuinely fascinating and genuinely moving in how Roman women used the making of a will as one of the clearest, most direct expressions of the independence their wealth afforded them, a moment when a woman's own wishes, documented and witnessed and legally binding, could override the ordinary social expectation that everything would simply pass, unremarked, to the nearest appropriate male relative. A Roman will required, technically, the participation of witnesses and, for women at least in earlier periods, the formal cooperation of a guardian, though by Aurelia's era that guardian's actual power to block or reshape her wishes had worn down close to nothing in practice. What survives, in the legal writings of Roman jurists and in scattered documentary evidence from across the empire, shows women leaving their fortunes in patterns that reveal a great deal about how they actually understood their own relationships and obligations, patterns that did not always follow the neat, expected lines of blood inheritance a modern person might assume. Wealthy Roman women frequently left substantial bequests to freedmen and freedwomen who had served them loyally, sometimes naming a trusted former slave as an heir alongside her own children, a choice that could occasionally trigger real family tension, since it meant dividing an estate with someone outside the direct bloodline, but which also reflected something genuine about the actual working relationships these households had built over decades of shared labor and, in many documented cases, real personal loyalty. A steward who had managed a woman's shipping interests faithfully for 20 years, who had grown her fortune rather than skimmed from it, who had, in some surviving cases, personally intervened to protect her interests during a crisis, was not an abstraction to her by the time she came to write her final wishes. He was someone whose competence and loyalty she had tested repeatedly over years, in circumstances where the temptation to cheat her would have been genuinely easy to act on and difficult to detect, and a woman rewarding that loyalty with a portion of her estate was making a calculated, entirely reasonable judgment about where her trust actually belonged, regardless of what bloodline formally required. Roman law also developed the practice of fideikommissum, a trust, essentially, in which a person left property to one individual with the informal, though eventually legally enforceable, request that it ultimately pass to someone else, a mechanism that gave testators, women included, remarkable flexibility in shaping exactly how their wealth would move through subsequent generations, allowing a woman to provide for a daughter's immediate needs through one relative, while ensuring, through the trust structure, that a grandchild or a more distant relation eventually received the property she truly wanted them to hold. This was not simple paperwork. It required real legal sophistication to draft correctly, and wealthy women, Aurelia very much included, generally consulted with a jurist, sometimes a family friend with legal training, sometimes a professional advocate retained specifically for the purpose, to ensure the language of the will could not easily be challenged or reinterpreted after her death by relatives disappointed with what they had or had not been left. And here, I think, is the detail that captures something quietly important about the whole system we have spent tonight exploring. A Roman will, once properly executed, was one of the very few moments in a woman's entire legal existence when her own voice, her own explicit, documented wishes, carried the full, unambiguous force of law, unmediated by a father's authority or a husband's name or a guardian's nominal oversight. Everything else in her life moved through some degree of filtration, some formal acknowledgement, however thin, that a man's authority stood somewhere nearby. Her will spoke directly, in her own words, recorded by her own instruction, and it was enforced by the full weight of the Roman legal system regardless of whether any surviving male relative approved of what she had chosen to say in it. It is a strange, almost backward kind of freedom, arriving only at the very end of a life, activated only by death itself, but it was real, and Roman women across the centuries we have been tracing tonight used it with genuine deliberateness, shaping from beyond their own final breath exactly how the wealth they had spent decades building would continue moving through the world after they were gone. Let me pull you back a few hours now, before the bath, before the dinner, into the middle of Aurelia's afternoon, because there is a walk she takes most days, down to the harbour district and back through the Forum, and I think it is worth slowing down inside that walk for a while, since it is where the abstract shape of her wealth becomes, suddenly, entirely physical, entirely walkable, entirely something you could reach out and touch if you were beside her. She leaves the house on foot, accompanied by a slave who walks a pace behind her, and by one of her freedmen, the one who manages her shipping interests most directly, since today's errand involves checking on the arrival of a vessel that was due into the harbour sometime this week. The street outside her house, the one whose blank, unremarkable wall we described right at the start of tonight's story, is busy in the particular disordered, layered way that Roman streets genuinely were. Nothing like the wide, orderly boulevards later eras sometimes imagine when they picture ancient cities. Shop fronts open directly onto the pavement, their wooden shutters folded back to reveal the goods inside, a baker's oven glowing orange in the back of one narrow space, the smell of baking bread mixing, a few doors down, with the sharper, more pungent smell of a shop selling garum, the fermented fish sauce that Romans used the way a modern kitchen might use salt, an ingredient so central to Roman cooking that entire industries, entire coastal towns, built their economies around producing it. 2 of the shops along this street belong to Aurelia. She rents them out to tenants, a cobbler in one, a small workshop producing bronze fittings and household hardware in the other, and the rent from those 2 modest, unglamorous storefronts paid monthly forms one small, steady thread in the larger fabric of her income. Less exciting than a shipping venture, less prestigious than a brickyard, but reliable in a way those grander investments could never quite match, since a cobbler needs his shop rain or shine, war or peace, in a way a merchant ship crossing an unpredictable winter sea simply does not. She passes through the edge of the Forum on her way to the harbour, and here, briefly, the street opens up into genuine civic grandeur, colonnaded porticos, the steps of a temple rising white and clean in the afternoon sun, the low, constant murmur of a public space genuinely full of people, money changers at small tables, a notary reading a document aloud to a small cluster of interested onlookers, a group of boys being walked somewhere by a tutor, their satchels of wax tablets bumping against their legs. This is where Eumachia's building stands. In towns fortunate enough to have one, this is where a wealthy woman's name, carved permanently into stone, becomes something every single person crossing the Forum that day walks past without necessarily even glancing up, the way you might walk past a familiar street sign without truly seeing it, and yet the name is there regardless, quietly doing its work, quietly reminding the city, generation after generation, of exactly whose money had built the ground beneath their feet. Down toward the harbour, the smell changes again, salt and tar, and the specific briny sharpness of drying fish, the sound of gulls circling overhead in loud argumentative clusters, and the harbour itself opens up, crowded with vessels of every size, from small local fishing boats to the broad-bellied merchant corbeta ships we discussed earlier, their masts a kind of irregular forest against the sky. Aurelia's freedman speaks briefly with a harbour official, checking the arrival records, and confirms what she had hoped. Her vessel arrived safely 2 days ago, its cargo of wine already unloaded and moved into a rented storage warehouse near the docks, waiting now to be distributed to the merchants and shopkeepers who will actually sell it retail across the city. She does not need to inspect the cargo personally. Her freedman has already done that, has already confirmed the amphorae arrived intact, unbroken, the wine inside untainted by seawater or spoilage. but she likes to come down here anyway, occasionally, to see the ships herself, to smell the harbour, to remind herself, in a physical, sensory way, that no wax tablet full of numbers could ever quite replicate exactly what her money is actually doing out there in the wider world, crossing seas, feeding cities, moving through hands she has never met and places she will, quite possibly, never personally see. There is a woman Aurelia knows slightly through the loose, overlapping social networks that connect a city's wealthier households, who deserves a proper mention here because she represents a category of Roman professional woman we have not yet spent enough time with tonight. The medica, the female physician, a genuinely recognized medical role that Roman society, somewhat surprisingly given everything else we have discussed about restricted female participation in formal professions, accepted with real practicality. Female physicians appear across the Roman epigraphic record with enough regularity that historians no longer treat them as rare curiosities, but as a genuine, if numerically modest, professional category. Women who trained, often within families where medical knowledge passed from mother to daughter, or from a skilled female relative to a promising younger woman, and who treated patients, particularly though not exclusively other women, for conditions ranging from ordinary illness to the specific complications of pregnancy and childbirth that we discussed a little earlier. Some of these women achieved genuine local prominence and presumably genuine wealth from their practice, their tombstones recording the title Medica with the same straightforward pride other inscriptions reserve for a trade like purple dyeing or wool merchandising. The line between a formally trained medica and the more informally skilled midwife, the obstetrix, blurred considerably in practice, since childbirth remained, throughout the Roman period, primarily managed by women for women, with male physicians called in, when they were called in at all, generally only for the most severe and dangerous complications. This meant that female medical knowledge, built and transmitted almost entirely outside the more formal, male-dominated philosophical medical schools that produced writers like Galen, whose name survives prominently in the historical record precisely because his writings were preserved and copied for centuries afterward, represented an enormous, largely undocumented body of practical expertise, held by women whose names in the vast majority of cases simply did not survive the way a wealthy patron's building inscription might. Aurelia's own household employs a slave woman with genuine skill in this area, trained originally, according to the household's own records, by her own mother, another slave, in a technique passed down across at least 2 generations before either woman ever crossed paths with Aurelia's family. This woman attended both of Aurelia's own childbirths, and Aurelia trusts her judgment on a wide range of everyday household health matters more than she trusts the more expensively credentialed male physician her husband occasionally calls in for his own complaints. A small, private household hierarchy of trust that quietly inverts the more official, more visible hierarchy of Roman medical prestige. Wealth again shows its strange double edge here. It gave Aurelia access to genuinely skilled medical care within her own household, care that likely saved her own life during at least one of those childbirths. But the woman providing that care remained, throughout, legally enslaved, her considerable skill generating value for a household that did not, and structurally could not, fully recognize her as anything other than property, however genuinely, personally valued that property might have been. I want to take you inside a workshop now, a real, working textile operation of the kind that fed the more glamorous end of Roman fashion, since we have talked a great deal tonight about the finished, expensive results, the purple-bordered stola, the imported silk, but not nearly as much about the actual physical labor and craft that produced them. And I think that gap is worth filling in properly before the night moves on. Somewhere across the city from Aurelia's own domus, in a district given over to workshops and small manufacturing operations rather than fine residential housing, there is a fullery, a fabric processing workshop of exactly the kind Eumachia's building in Pompeii was dedicated to serving, where wool cloth arrives newly woven, still rough, still carrying the natural oils and impurities of the raw fleece, and undergoes a whole sequence of treatment before it becomes the finished fabric a wealthy household would actually wear. Workers, many of them enslaved, some free but poor enough to need the wage, stand in shallow stone basins treading cloth soaked in a cleaning solution that, uncomfortably enough for modern sensibilities, traditionally included stale urine, collected specifically for this purpose, its ammonia content genuinely effective at breaking down grease and dirt in the wool fibers, a detail Roman writers mention with the same matter-of-fact practicality they bring to almost any industrial process, since to them it was simply chemistry, however unglamorous its source. After cleaning, the cloth is beaten, stretched on frames, brushed to raise a soft nap, and, if it is destined for dyeing, moved into a separate section of the workshop entirely, where vats of prepared dye sit ready, their exact contents depending entirely on what colour and what price point the finished cloth is aiming for. A workshop like this one, if it processes the purple bordered fabric Aurelia's stola was cut from, maintains a careful, guarded relationship with a specific dye supplier, since Tyrian purple, as we discussed earlier, was not something an ordinary workshop simply mixed up on its own premises. The murex harvesting and initial dye extraction happened at specialized coastal facilities, sometimes owned or heavily invested in by wealthy families precisely because the enormous startup cost and specialized knowledge required to run a purple dye operation profitably created real barriers that kept the trade concentrated in relatively few well-capitalized hands. The finished dye, transported inland in sealed containers, arrives at the workshop and is applied to cloth already prepared and mordanted, a chemical pre-treatment step that helps the dye bind permanently to the fibre rather than washing back out. And the actual dyeing process itself, for true Tyrian purple, could require multiple soakings, the cloth dipped, dried, dipped again, the colour deepening gradually with each pass, since a single quick dip would produce a thinner, less prestigious shade that a discerning buyer or a discerning buyer's steward sent to inspect the goods before purchase would recognize immediately as inferior. Roman writers describing the finest purple describe a color that shifted slightly depending on the angle of light, sometimes reading closer to a deep, almost black red, sometimes catching a genuinely violet undertone. And that shifting quality, that visual complexity that a cheaper single-source dye simply could not replicate, was itself part of what made true Tyrian purple so instantly recognizable to anyone with the trained eye of real wealth. A finished bolt of purple-bordered cloth ready for sale represented, by the time it reached a household like Aurelia's, the accumulated labor of harvesters gathering thousands of sea snails along a stretch of Mediterranean coastline, of workers standing over fermenting vats in a stench strong enough to require legal separation from the rest of the city, of weavers producing the base cloth, of fullers cleaning and preparing it, of dyers applying and reapplying the color with real technical skill, and of merchants and middlemen moving the finished product across whatever distance separated its point of production from its point of sale. Every single stripe of purple on the hem of Aurelia's formal garment, in other words, was a small compressed monument to an entire sprawling supply chain, most of it invisible to her. Most of it staffed by people whose names would never appear on any inscription anywhere, their labour folded permanently into a colour she wore, on special occasions, without necessarily thinking very hard about where exactly it had all actually come from. Let me carry this story forward now, past Aurelia's own lifetime, into the centuries that followed, because I think it matters to know that the pattern we have spent tonight tracing did not simply vanish with the slow, uneven decline of the Western Roman Empire. It changed shape, the way a river changes shape when the landscape around it shifts, but it kept flowing, in recognizable form, for a genuinely long time afterward. As Christianity spread through the Roman world across the 3rd and 4th centuries, eventually becoming the empire's dominant and then official religion, the old patterns of wealthy female patronage did not disappear so much as redirect themselves toward new institutions, where a woman like Eumachaia had funded a guild hall for the fullers of Pompeia, a wealthy Christian woman of the 4th century might instead fund a church, a monastery, a hospice for the sick and the poor. The underlying instinct, wealth converted into permanent, visible, socially honored good works, remaining essentially unchanged even as the specific religious and architectural language around it transformed completely. Paula of Rome, a wealthy aristocratic widow of the 4th century, used her considerable inherited fortune to fund an extensive network of monasteries and hospices, eventually traveling to the Holy Land and establishing religious communities there, working closely with the scholar Jerome, whose famous Latin translation of the Bible, the Vulgate, was produced partly with Paula's direct financial and even scholarly support, since she was, by several contemporary accounts, genuinely learned in Hebrew and Greek herself, capable of engaging with the textual scholarship at a level that went well beyond simply writing checks for other people's work. Melania the Younger, from a similarly wealthy senatorial Roman family, sold off an enormous portfolio of estates scattered across Italy, Sicily, North Africa, Spain, and Gaul, using the proceeds to fund monasteries and charitable works on a scale that ancient biographers describe with a kind of genuine astonishment at the sheer geographic reach of the property she had inherited and then deliberately dismantled in the name of her faith. What strikes me most about these later Christian noblewomen, looking back at them from the vantage point of everything we have discussed tonight, is how directly they inherited the same legal and economic infrastructure that had made Livia's brickyards and Aurelia's shipping shares possible centuries earlier. The Roman legal architecture of sine manu marriage, of independent female property ownership, of a woman's right to direct her own fortune through a will, had not been invented by or for Christianity, but it proved remarkably well suited to a new generation of wealthy women who wanted to redirect enormous inherited estates toward an entirely new set of institutions and priorities. The mechanism stayed the same. The destination changed. Further east, as the Western Empire finally fragmented in the 5th century while its eastern half persisted, reorganizing itself into what historians now call the Byzantine Empire, this same underlying tradition of powerful, independently wealthy women continued for another 1,000 years, reaching its most famous expression perhaps in a figure like Theodora, wife of the 6th century Emperor Justinian, whose own rise from a genuinely humble, even scandalous background to become one of the most powerful women in the history of the Mediterranean world would deserve, honestly, an entire night of its own telling, another story for another evening, sitting somewhere further down the long unbroken thread that started, for our purposes tonight, with a Roman father handing over his daughter's dowry, and a piece of Roman law that quietly, almost accidentally, decided that dowry and everything she built from it afterward would remain hers and hers alone for as long as she lived. Let me slow all the way down now because I think we have covered enough of the wider world. The shipping and the brickyards and the imperial widows and the monasteries of late antiquity, and I want to spend the rest of tonight simply resting inside the smaller, quieter textures of a wealthy Roman household. The kind of detail that does not teach you very much about economic history, but teaches you, I think, something truer about what it might have actually felt like to live inside one of these lives, hour by hour, object by object. Think about the storeroom off Aurelia's kitchen, the penis, where the household's provisions are kept under the watchful management of a slave specifically responsible for tracking what comes in and what goes out, since a household this size consumes an enormous constant volume of food, and waste or theft, left unmonitored, could quietly bleed away a surprising amount of a family's wealth over the course of a year. Amphorae line the walls, taller than a person's waist in some cases, sealed with pitch and clay, holding wine, olive oil, the fermented fish sauce we mentioned earlier, each one marked, sometimes with painted labels called tituli picti, recording the contents, the origin, sometimes even the specific estate or producer, a kind of ancient product labeling that archaeologists now rely on constantly to trace exactly how far Roman trade networks actually stretched. Baskets hold dried legumes, chickpeas and lentils, and the broad beans Romans ate constantly across every social class. Strings of garlic and onions hang from wooden beams. Jars of honey, Rome's primary sweetener since sugar as we know it, remained essentially unknown in the Mediterranean world, sit sealed and heavy on a lower shelf. Honey valued highly enough that beekeeping itself formed a genuine, respected agricultural specialty, with its own body of technical writing devoted to managing hives properly. Think about the specific quality of light in Aurelia's bedroom at the hour she finally lies down, a single small oil lamp left burning low on a bedside table, its flame steady in the still air of a room with thick walls and a heavy wooden door. The kind of quiet, contained darkness that a modern city with its constant ambient electric glow almost never fully offers anymore. Think about the weight of the woolen blankets on her bed, dyed a deep warm colour, woven quite possibly from thread spun on that same household loom we described earlier, a small, circular piece of continuity running from her own hands at the spindle to the blanket now settling warm across her shoulders. Think about the sounds of the house at this hour, mostly silence but not complete silence. The occasional creak of a wooden beam settling as the temperature drops slightly overnight. The distant, muffled sound of a slave somewhere still finishing a late task. Banked coals shifting faintly in the kitchen hearth 2 rooms away. A dog, if the household keeps one, sighing and resettling itself near the atrium door. There is a particular kind of peace, I think, that belongs specifically to a person who has spent a long day handling real responsibility competently, and then finally sets it down. Aurelia's day held genuine stakes, a shipment that might have been lost at sea but was not, a loan that needed careful judgment about a borrower's reliability, a household of dozens of people whose well-being, in ways both practical and legal, rested substantially on her ongoing attention and management. None of it was decorative, none of it was simply performance for the sake of looking busy, and now, in the quiet of her own bedroom, with the lamp burning low and the blankets heavy and warm, all of that weight has been set down for the night, waiting patiently in the wax tablets locked in her study, ready to be picked back up again in the morning. But not yet, not tonight, not for these last few slow, unhurried minutes before sleep finally arrives. Let me tell you gently about what happened when a wealthy Roman woman like Aurelia eventually did die, because Roman funerary custom for someone of real means was elaborate in a way that tells us, one final time, how thoroughly wealth shaped every stage of a life, right through to its very last public moment. A wealthy Roman funeral was not a quiet private affair. It was a procession moving through the streets of the city in full public view, and for a woman of real standing, that procession could include hired professional mourners, women specifically paid to weep and wail and tear at their own hair and clothing with theatrical practiced grief. Their performance meant to signal, publicly, exactly how significant a loss this death represented to the whole community, not merely to the immediate family. Musicians walked alongside, playing flutes and horns in a mournful processional rhythm, and if the deceased came from a family with genuine political or civic prominence, actors sometimes walked in the procession wearing wax masks, imagines, molded to resemble the deceased's own ancestors, a startling, almost theatrical practice that meant a funeral procession could include what looked, to a modern eye, like a small parade of the dead woman's entire family history, walking silently through the streets alongside her actual body. Generations of ancestors briefly, eerily present again for one final public appearance. The body itself, before the procession, would have been washed, anointed with the same kinds of scented oils we discussed earlier in the context of daily perfume, dressed in fine clothing, sometimes, for a woman of real wealth, in her very best garments, jewellery included, laid out for a period of public viewing in the atrium of her own house, that same rain-fed, light-filled central room where her household had gathered every single morning of her adult life, now transformed temporarily into a space of formal mourning, friends and relatives and clients filing through to pay their respects before the body was finally carried out for the procession to the burial site, generally located, by long-standing Roman law, outside the formal boundary of the city itself, along one of the roads leading away from town, precisely the kind of road where inscribed tombs like Aurelia would stand for centuries afterward, facing outward toward every traveller entering or leaving the city. But the burial site itself, depending on the period and the family's particular custom, the body might be buried intact or cremated, Roman practice shifting gradually across the centuries from a strong early preference for cremation toward increasingly common burial by the 2nd and 3rd centuries, a shift historians still debate the exact causes of, though the rising influence of certain religious traditions, including eventually Christianity, likely played some role. A funeral oration, if the family could arrange one, praised the deceased's virtues in exactly the language we discussed earlier when we talked about tombstone inscriptions, her devotion, her modesty, her skill at woolworking, and, increasingly by the height of the imperial period, her genuine accomplishments in business and public benefaction, spoken aloud to the assembled crowd before the tomb was finally sealed. And then, in the weeks and months that followed, the household she had run so carefully, the freedman she had trusted with her shipping and money-lending interests, the daughter she had quietly taught to read a contract and calculate an interest rate, the accounts and property her will had so deliberately, so specifically distributed, all of it continued moving forward without her, the way a river continues moving after a single stone dropped into it has finally settled to the bottom, the ripples widening outward, gradually softening, but the water itself still flowing on, carrying forward everything she had built, in whatever new hands now held it. There is one more story I want to tell you before we let the night close in fully around Aurelia and her sleeping household, because it is in some ways the clearest, most direct moment in the entire span of Roman history when wealthy women stood up, quite literally in public, and argued for their own economic interests, using their own voices rather than the quieter, indirect language of brick stamps and building inscriptions we have spent so much of tonight following. In the year 42 before our era, in the chaotic years following the assassination of Julius Caesar, the 3 men who had seized control of Rome, Octavian, Mark Antony, and a third figure named Lepidus, together known as the Second Triumvirate, needed money urgently to fund the military campaigns they were waging against Caesar's assassins. They settled on a plan to impose a direct property tax on 1,400 of the wealthiest women in Rome, a tax that notably these same women had no formal political voice to protest through any conventional channel, since, as we have discussed at length tonight, Roman women could not vote, could not hold office, could not stand before the Senate in their own right to argue against a policy that would directly, substantially reduce their own personal fortunes. They protested anyway. A group of these wealthy women, led by a woman named Hortensia, daughter of the famous orator Quintus Hortensius, one of the great courtroom speakers of the previous generation, marched to the forum and remarkably gained an audience before the triumvirs themselves, where Hortensia delivered a speech recorded, at least in substantial paraphrase, by the later historian Appian, arguing directly, forcefully, and with real rhetorical skill against the tax. She argued that women had no part in the wars, the offices, the political conflicts that had created the crisis the triumvirs now wanted women's money to solve, that women held no share in the honours, the commands, the statecraft for which men fought and spent public money, and that it was therefore deeply unjust to demand they shoulder a tax burden created entirely by conflicts they had no voice in causing. The triumvirs, by Appian's account, were furious, initially ordering the crowd of women dispersed by force, but the political pressure and frankly the sheer unusual audacity of the moment, a woman delivering formal political oratory in the forum, a space almost entirely reserved for male civic speech, eventually forced a compromise. The number of women subject to the tax reduced substantially, though not eliminated. Hortensia's speech survives, in the form we have it, filtered through a later historian writing in Greek more than a century afterward, and we should hold it with the appropriate historian's caution that some of its polish likely reflects Appian's own literary elaboration rather than Hortensia's exact words. But the underlying event, women organizing collectively, marching on the forum and successfully forcing a political concession from the most powerful men in Rome through direct public argument rather than private behind-the-scenes influence, is not in serious historical doubt. I think about Hortensia often when I think about everything else we have discussed tonight, because her speech makes explicit something that Livia's brickyards and Eumachia's building and Turia's quiet courage during the proscriptions all imply, without ever quite saying outright. Roman women understood, with real clarity, the fundamental unfairness of a system that let them accumulate genuine substantial wealth, while denying them almost any formal voice in the political decisions that governed how that wealth could be used, taxed or protected. Most of the time across the centuries we have traced tonight, that understanding expressed itself quietly, through careful management, through shrewd business decisions, through the slow, patient accumulation of property and influence within the boundaries the law allowed. But every so often, when the pressure became acute enough, when a tax or a policy threatened to strip away what decades of careful management had built, that quiet competence could turn briefly, unmistakably, into direct public argument, a woman standing in the forum itself, speaking in her own voice to the most powerful men in the world and making them listen. Let me take you to the public baths for a moment too before we finish, because although we spent time earlier in Aurelia's own small private bath suite, the great communal bathhouses that anchor daily social life in every Roman city deserve their own space in this story, since they were, in their own particular way, another arena where a wealthy woman's status quietly, visibly asserted itself, even in a setting theoretically open to almost everyone in the city regardless of means. Public baths in Rome and across the empire operated on a genuinely remarkable scale. Enormous complexes of heated pools, cold plunge pools, exercise courts, libraries in some of the grandest examples, and gardens, all built and, in many cases, maintained through a combination of public funding and, again, that same tradition of wealthy private benefaction we discussed earlier, meaning a bath complex a wealthy woman used on an ordinary afternoon might well have been funded decades earlier by the benefaction of another wealthy woman entirely, her name recorded somewhere on the building's facade even as the crowds moving through its heated rooms had long since stopped consciously registering it. Entrance fees were by most accounts kept deliberately low, sometimes a fraction of the smallest available coin, meaning the baths functioned as one of the genuinely more socially mixed spaces in Roman daily life, bringing together, at least within the same physical building if not always the same specific rooms or hours, people across a real range of wealth and status. Bathing hours for women were often separated from men's hours, either through a schedule that reserved certain hours of the day exclusively for women, or, in the larger, more elaborate complexes, through entirely separate wings and pools built specifically for female bathers. A wealthy woman visiting the baths would typically bring at least one slave attending her, carrying her oil flask, her strigil, a change of clothing, and would move through the sequence of rooms, a warm room to begin loosening the body, a hot room with steam and heated pools to open the pores and work up a genuine sweat, and finally a cold plunge to close things back down again. The same basic thermal sequence that saunas and spa cultures across much of the modern world still follow today, whether or not the people using them realize how directly they are echoing a 2,000-year-old Roman routine. It was, by most contemporary accounts, a genuinely social occasion, not simply a hygiene errand, women gathering to talk, to exchange news, to negotiate small pieces of business or arrange future social engagements while soaking in warm water, the bathhouse functioning almost like an informal social club that happened to also get you clean. And here again, wealth showed itself in small telling details rather than grand gestures. The quality of the oil a woman's slave carried for her, the fineness of the linen towel waiting for her afterward, the confidence and familiarity with which the attendants working the baths greeted a woman clearly known to them as a generous regular patron rather than an occasional anonymous visitor, even in a space built, at least in theory, around a shared civic amenity available to nearly everyone. The accumulated texture of genuine wealth still found its way, quietly, consistently into how the experience actually felt from the inside. I want to pause before we let the night close all the way in and tell you a little about how we actually know any of this, because I think it adds something real to sit with. The sheer, patient, accumulated labor of the people who dug all of this back up out of the ground, centuries later, and pieced it together into something we can now hold in our minds on a quiet evening like this one. The brick stamps we discussed earlier, the small pressed inscriptions naming Livia's estates or Domitia Lucilla's brickworks, survive in truly enormous quantities. Tens of thousands of individual examples catalogued across museums and excavation archives throughout Italy and beyond, and it took generations of specialist scholars working through the tedious, unglamorous labor of recording, cross-referencing, and dating each individual stamp to build the kind of comprehensive picture that lets a historian today say, with real confidence, exactly which estates were producing brick in which decades, and who specifically owned them. It is not thrilling work most days sorting through boxes of broken clay fragments in a storage room, but it is exactly this kind of patient, cumulative labor that eventually allows someone, a very long time later, to reconstruct the shape of a woman's industrial fortune from nothing more than the fired clay remnants of what her workshops once produced. The papyrus documents from Egypt that we mentioned earlier represent an entirely different kind of archaeological gift, preserved not through anyone's deliberate intention, but through pure accidental luck. Egypt's exceptionally dry climate simply failing to rot away organic material the way the damper climates of Italy or Gaul or Britain inevitably did. Rubbish heaps outside ancient Egyptian towns, genuinely literal ancient garbage dumps, have yielded thousands upon thousands of discarded documents, tax receipts, marriage contracts, personal letters, shopping lists, school exercises, an almost embarrassingly rich, unfiltered window into the actual daily texture of life in the Roman world, precisely because nobody at the time thought any of it worth carefully preserving. They simply threw it away, the way you might discard an old receipt today, and 2,000 years of dry desert air did the rest, keeping it intact until modern archaeologists began sifting through those ancient rubbish heaps in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, gradually realizing what an extraordinary resource they had stumbled into. And then there is Pompeii itself and its sister site Herculaneum, buried and in a strange, terrible way, preserved by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in the year 79, a catastrophe that killed a genuinely uncertain but substantial number of people and simultaneously froze an entire slice of Roman urban life in place with a completeness that no other site in the ancient world can quite match. Eumachia's building, the one we discussed at real length tonight, survives specifically because Pompeii was buried rather than gradually built over and demolished and rebuilt the way most ancient cities were, across the centuries, by the ordinary churn of continuous habitation. We can read her inscription today, standing on the same paving stones her contemporaries once walked, precisely because a natural disaster nearly 2,000 years ago accidentally created the most complete, most legible archaeological time capsule in the history of the ancient Mediterranean world. A genuinely uncomfortable thought to sit with, that our clearest window into these women's lives exists specifically because of a catastrophe that ended so many other lives so abruptly and so completely. Let me bring us back one final time to the shape of the contradiction we started with tonight, because I think it deserves to be looked at once more now that we have filled in so much of the texture around it. The brickyards and the shipping shares and the purple dye vats and the funerary inscriptions, since a contradiction examined only once at the very beginning of a story tends to feel abstract in a way that the same contradiction revisited after hours of specific, grounded detail simply does not. A Roman woman could not vote. She could not stand for public office. In the formal architecture of Roman civic life, she was technically permanently a legal minor of sorts, required, at least on paper, to answer to a father, a husband, or a guardian for essentially her entire existence. And yet Livia owned brickworks and copper mines and fig orchards substantial enough that her name still turns up, unearthed in archaeological digs across Italy 2,000 years later. Eumachia funded one of the largest buildings on the forum of an entire city and had her name carved permanently into its front wall. Fulvia raised troops and held besieged cities and possibly had her face pressed into circulating Roman coinage. Turia defended her family's inheritance through a civil war with a courage her own husband, writing her memorial, clearly still found remarkable decades later. Domitia Lucilla's brick stamps built half of Rome. Umidia Quadratilla owned an entire troupe of performers and funded an amphitheatre. Hortensia stood in the forum itself and argued down a tax imposed by the most powerful men alive. None of this happened despite Roman law. It happened in a strange, almost accidental way because of a very specific, narrow legal mechanism, sine manu marriage and independent female property rights, that the Roman state never actually intended as an instrument of female empowerment. Roman lawmakers built that mechanism to protect family bloodlines, to keep a daughter's inheritance from simply dissolving into her husband's estate if the marriage went badly, to preserve the tidy patrilineal logic of Roman inheritance across generations. Female economic independence was, in the truest sense, a side effect, an unintended consequence of a legal system designed to solve an entirely different problem. And once that side effect existed, certain women, generation after generation, century after century, simply walked through the door it had accidentally left open, and built, inside that narrow legal space, fortunes and reputations and, in a handful of remarkable cases, genuine political influence that the architects of Roman family law almost certainly never imagined when they first drafted the rules. I find something quietly hopeful in that, actually, even now, even this late in the evening, thinking it through one last time before we let Aurelia's household, and yours, finally settle into sleep. Systems built to constrain people do not always constrain them completely. Somewhere inside almost every rigid structure, there is a gap, a loophole, an unintended mechanism nobody fully anticipated, and history is full of people, women especially, across every era we could possibly tell stories about on this channel, who found that gap and quietly, patiently, without necessarily ever overturning the larger structure around them, built something real and lasting inside it anyway. The lamp beside Aurelia's bed has burned low now, its flame small and steady, casting just enough light to pick out the shape of the painted wall beside her. Dolphins and vines she has looked at every night for years without really seeing them anymore, the way any of us stop truly seeing the familiar walls of our own bedrooms after enough repeated nights inside them. Somewhere beyond her window, the city itself is settling into that particular late-hour quiet that every Roman town, however loud and crowded during the day, eventually reached once the sun went down and oil became too expensive to burn carelessly, and most ordinary people simply went to bed with the darkness, rather than fighting against it the way a modern city, wired bright with electric light, never quite has to. Somewhere across town, in another house behind another plain, unremarkable street-facing wall, another wealthy woman is doing more or less exactly what Aurelia has just finished doing, closing her own accounts for the night, checking on her own sleeping children, settling into her own bed beneath her own woolen blankets. And somewhere further out, past the edge of the city, along the road where the tombs stand facing every traveller who passes, the stone monuments of women like Aurelia Tyche sit quiet and dark under whatever moon is out tonight, their carved inscriptions unreadable in the darkness but still there, still holding their carefully chosen words, waiting for morning light to make them legible again to whoever happens to walk past. I think, lying here with you in the dark, about all the women whose names we never got to say tonight, because for every Livia and Eumachia and Turia whose story survived clearly enough to tell, there were thousands upon thousands of other wealthy Roman women whose lives left only a faint, partial trace, a single brick stamp with a name we cannot connect to any other surviving record, a fragment of a funerary inscription broken exactly where the most interesting detail would have been, a single line in a legal document mentioning a woman's dowry without telling us anything at all about what she actually did with the rest of her life afterward. History is like that, always, a vast, mostly silent ocean with a handful of specific, well-lit islands rising up out of it, Eumachia's building still standing, Turia's stone still readable, Livia's brick stamps still turning up in fresh excavations even now, in our own decade, while beneath the surface, unseen, unrecoverable, countless other equally full, equally complicated lives simply dissolved back into the ground, along with the women who lived them. That should not make you sad exactly, though I understand if it settles into something close to that feeling. I think of it more as a kind of quiet respect, extended backward across 2,000 years, toward every unnamed woman who managed a household, who negotiated a dowry, who spun wool by lamplight, and also quite possibly argued shrewdly with a freedman about the price of a shipment of wine, whose entire life, full and complicated and real in exactly the way your own life is full and complicated and real right now, simply never happened to leave the specific kind of durable trace that lets a historian, 2 millennia later, say her name out loud again. Down the corridor from Aurelia's own room, her daughter sleeps in a smaller bed, a nurse dozing on a low cot nearby, in case the child wakes and needs something in the night. The same quiet, layered arrangement of care that wraps around every member of this household in slightly different form depending on their age and their role within it. The girl's wax tablet, the one she has been practicing her letters and her simple sums on, under the household tutor's patient supervision, sits on a small table beside her bed, a few lines of careful, still slightly uneven handwriting pressed into the soft wax, tomorrow's lesson waiting exactly where she left it, half finished, the way a child's work always seems to be half finished, permanently, right up until the moment, years from now, when it suddenly, almost without anyone noticing the transition, is not. Aurelia thinks in the last drowsy minutes before sleep finally takes her about the shape her daughter's life will eventually take, the marriage that will be negotiated for her in a handful of years, the dowry that will be carefully calculated and documented, the household she will eventually run, whether here in this same city or somewhere else entirely, carried off by marriage to a husband whose own family's fortune and character remain, for now, still entirely unknown. She cannot control most of that. No mother in any century really can. Not fully, however much careful preparation she pours into a child's education and character in the years before that larger, less controllable world takes over, that she can, and she has, given her daughter something that feels, to Aurelia at least, like the single most important inheritance available to pass along, not the ships, not the brickyard shares, not even the dowry itself, but the simple practical knowledge of exactly how those things work, how to read a contract closely, how to judge a freedman's honesty, how to calculate whether a loan's interest rate genuinely reflects its risk. Money can be lost, money can be taken, mismanaged, squandered by a careless husband or a dishonest steward. But the understanding of how money actually moves through the world, once it has been genuinely thoroughly learned, is much harder for anyone else to take away. The lamp finally gutters, its oil nearly spent, and the room settles into a deeper, more complete darkness, the kind that a Roman house with its thick walls and its heavy doors could genuinely offer in a way that feels almost luxurious to imagine now, in a world so rarely fully dark anymore. Somewhere in that darkness, Aurelia's breathing slows, deepens, and the last conscious threads of the day, the harbour, the wine shipment, the loan due next month, her daughter's careful, uneven handwriting, all of it finally loosens and dissolves into whatever quieter, less orderly territory the mind wanders into once sleep actually arrives. There is one more woman I want to introduce to you before we finally let this story rest completely, because although she lived earlier than most of the figures we have discussed tonight, in the middle of the 2nd century before our era, her story sits so close to the emotional center of everything we have been circling around that I could not in good conscience leave her out entirely. Her name was Cornelia, daughter of the great general Scipio Africanus, and she became, after her husband's death, one of the most admired widows in the entire history of the Roman Republic, not primarily for the size of her fortune, though it was genuinely substantial, but for how she chose to use it. Widowed relatively young, with 12 children by some accounts, though only 3 survived to adulthood, Cornelia turned down at least one prestigious remarriage offer, reportedly from an Egyptian king, choosing instead to remain unmarried and devote herself, with real deliberateness, to raising and educating her surviving children herself, funding tutors, cultivating a household that later Roman writers describe as a genuine center of intellectual and literary life in the city. Philosophers and writers welcomed as regular guests at her table. There is a famous story, recorded by later Roman writers and almost certainly embellished in the retelling but revealing, regardless of its exact literal accuracy, of a wealthy visitor showing off her own jewelry to Cornelia and then asking, somewhat pointedly, to see Cornelia's own. Cornelia, the story goes, simply called her 2 sons into the room and said, "These are my jewels," a line that survived, repeated and admired, for the rest of Roman history, eventually becoming almost proverbial shorthand for a particular kind of maternal pride that valued character and achievement over gold and gemstones. Her sons Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus grew up to become 2 of the most significant, most controversial political reformers in the entire history of the Roman Republic, both eventually killed in the political violence their attempts at land reform provoked, and Cornelia lived long enough to bury both of them, a grief the ancient sources describe her bearing with a composed, dignified strength that itself became part of her enduring legend. She spent her final years at a villa on the coast, still corresponding, still receiving visitors, still, by every account, managing her own considerable household and fortune independently, honored across the city with a level of public respect that eventually extended to an actual public statue erected in her memory, an honor genuinely rare for any Roman woman of her era, inscribed simply, according to the sources that describe it, with her name and the identification "Mother of the Gracchi," a phrase that managed to be both entirely accurate and, in its own understated way, an enormous hard-earned tribute to everything she had built and endured across her long, independent widowhood. I bring Cornelia in at this late hour because I think her story rounds out something the more purely commercial figures we spent most of tonight discussing do not quite capture on their own. Wealth, for a woman like her, was never simply about accumulation for its own sake. It was a tool deployed with real intention toward building the kind of household, the kind of education, the kind of intellectual and political legacy she actually wanted to leave behind, regardless of how much personal grief that legacy eventually cost her. Money bought her the independence to say no to a king's marriage proposal. It bought her sons an education that shaped the entire subsequent trajectory of Roman political history. And in the end, it bought her the quiet, hard-won dignity of being remembered correctly as someone whose true wealth had never really been about the gold at all. Good night, my friend. Sleep well.